My name is Herb Solow. In the mid-1960s, over 30 years ago, I was vice president of Desilu Studios, vice president of Paramount Television, and executive in charge of production of the Star Trek series. As such, Gene Roddenberry and the entire Star Trek cast and crew reported to me. No decisions regarding personnel, casting, budgets, or Star Trek NBC affairs were made without my approval. Unfortunately, over these many years, much that has been made public about Star Trek has often come from the recycling of stories that have been embellished during the retelling. At times, little of the truth actually remains. And yet, I know more about the very beginnings of Star Trek, its development, its sale to NBC, its 2 pilots, and the production of the series than any other living being. In the entertainment business, as participants enter that gray-haired dinosaur segment of their lives, they suddenly are sought out for their knowledge of the past, and so it was with me. So, to borrow a contemporary expression, I guess I'm finally coming out of the Star Trek closet.
I'm Robert Justman, Bob or RJ to my friends. As associate producer and later co-producer of Star Trek, I worked hand-in-hand with both Gene Roddenberry and Herb Solow and was responsible for all phases of pre-production, production, and post-production of both pilots and the series. The all-encompassing and intense experience I had in making Star Trek, as well as the show's contribution to world culture, science, and the exploration of space, practically demanded that I tell the real story before it was too late. Things that only Gene Roddenberry, Herb Solow, and I knew. Then Gene died. Now there were only 2 of the original trio left. The story that needed to be told was still untold. One day Herb Solow stopped by to see me and said, "RJ, I'm going to write a book about Star Trek." "But what about me?" I exclaimed. "I should write that book too. Do you want a partner?" Herb said, "Great idea, RJ. Why didn't I think of that?" Of course, Herb had thought of it. That's why he came by in the first place. And that's why you're hearing this now. So settle back, take the phone off the hook, and get ready for an exclusive and revealing look into the past and the astonishing future it created.
Simon & Schuster Audio presents Inside Star Trek, The Real Story, written and read by Herbert F. Solow and Robert H. Justman.
The applause did not subside. The cheering continued. Finally, America's sweetheart, the fabulous redhead Lucille Ball, walked onto the stage and took another bow. It was another Thursday night, like so many other Thursday nights, as Lucy finished shooting a Lucy show before a live audience on Desilu Studios, Stage 12. Lucy, the brassy, red-haired showgirl from Jamestown, New York, and Desi Arnaz, the flamboyantly hot-blooded entertainer from Havana, Cuba, together as husband and wife, built a Hollywood icon, Desilu Studios. And then the unimaginable happened. Lucy and Desi divorced. Using borrowed money purported to be $3 million, Lucy bought out Desi's interest and ownership of the studio. Desilu was now Lucy and her old guard professionals. With hundreds of workers toiling at 3 widely separated physical plants, 2 in Hollywood and the other miles away in Culver City, Desilu's non-directive management made wrong decisions. The pilots and the series dwindled down to a precious few, and then there was only one, The Lucy Show. CBS saw the need to protect their investment in Desilu. Ted Ashley, the powerful head of the Ashley Famous Agency, saw a very good business deal. After the smoke of the divorce had cleared, Ashley Famous became the agents for Desilu. They would receive a percentage of gross sales of television series to the networks in perpetuity. There was still a void. CBS and Ashley Famous needed someone to run the studio. Several influential New York CBS executives agreed New Yorker Oscar Katz would be the man for the job. Katz was a highly regarded CBS television network executive who had been vice president of network programs. In due time, Katz resigned from CBS and moved to that foreign region of America called Hollywood. Enter Herb Solow.
It turned out that Oscar knew less about the Hollywood studio side of the television business than Desilu president Lucille Ball. In early 1964, I was working at NBC Burbank as head of daytime programs. The big event on that particular day was the Standards and Practices, the censors, problem dealing with a Pillsbury chocolate cake. The live commercial during a game show featured a spokesman slicing the cake and announcing, "It's 3 days old and still fresh and delicious." One of the censors had kept the cake in a vault to make sure it was really 3 days old. However, he'd been drinking heavily and had forgotten exactly when he'd taken possession of the chocolate cake. So, how old was the cake, really? Well, I decided to end my stay at this particular nut house and returned to my office to make some phone calls to find out what other kind of jobs were around. A message was waiting on my desk. Oscar Katz had called. I had known Oscar when I was at CBS, and I returned the call. "What can I do for you?" Oscar's voice got serious. "Do you know anything about film studios and labs and development deals and pilots?" "Sure," I said, not knowing how excited I should get, if at all. He asked, "Do you want to come over and take care of these things for me? I'm kind of a fish out of water here." Well, after saying thanks and farewell to my NBC boss, Grant Tinker, I arrived at Desilu Studios next door to Paramount Studios on Melrose Avenue. Oscar and I divided the chores. He would deal with important Desilu policy matters, the board of directors of which he was a member, Lucy, financial and legal matters, and that sort. I would take care of the series development, pilots, networks, and that sort. The next day I began series development with a search for the writers who would create pilots for us. Our agents represented a group of super writers, but to a small independent studio like Desilu, they were also super in demand, super busy, super expensive, and super unavailable. But Ashley Famous had many other writer clients. Of the writers, guys with pilot and series ideas attached, sent over to the studio at various times, 2 were of the star-crossed variety. They were as opposite as night and last Thursday morning. Bruce Geller, Yale graduate, Jewish, liberal exotic, son of the famous hanging judge, Justice Abe Geller of the New York State Superior Court, as Bruce described his father. Gene Roddenberry, Columbia Adult College Night Course, Southern Baptist, mumbling exotic and son of a bigoted Texan, as Gene later described his father, a small-town peace officer. Both seemed to have a streak of madness that would protect them and stand them in good stead at the reawakening Desilu. It was as if I'd posted a sign reading, "Normal people need not apply," and they were both jockeying to be first in line. Much has been written about the personal history of Gene Roddenberry. Some is factual, some is not. Gene himself over the years tended to intermix facts and fantasy. But then, that happens with many who are in the public eye. Yes, as Gene told me during those early years, he was a pilot for Pan Am who dead-headed on a Middle Eastern flight from Karachi that crashed in the Saudi Arabian desert. But no, Gene did not pull all the passengers from the burning wreckage by himself, fight off a raiding band of Arab tribesmen, and walk across the desert to the nearest phone and summon help. Yes, Gene was a contributing writer to Have Gun Will Travel, but not head writer of that series, nor did he create it. But yes, Gene did write more scripts than any of the show's freelance writers. Yes, Gene was a police officer for the LAPD. Yes, Gene wrote speeches for Chief William A. Parker. No, as a sergeant, Gene was not in line to replace Parker as Los Angeles police chief. Yes, Gene created and produced the television series The Lieutenant. Yes, the series was unsuccessful, lasting less than 1 year. Yes, Gene Roddenberry was out of work. That's when he showed up at my doorstep. It was April 1964. Lydia Schiller, my secretary, buzzed me on the intercom to advise that Mr. Roddenberry had arrived for his appointment. Knowing he was once a cop and an airline pilot, I very much expected a straight-backed, bright-eyed, dynamic, quick-paced individual who'd snap his way into my office. The door opened, and there was Gene Roddenberry. My first impression was that this tall, unkempt person, recently learned how to dress himself but hadn't quite gotten the knack. His gait reminded me of tepid water flowing from a slow faucet, and his hair unidirectionally flopped over his eyes like a very shaggy dog's. He smiled boyishly and mumbled, "Hi, I'm, Gene Roddenberry." He handed me a piece of paper wrinkled in the corner by his nervous fingers. "This is a series idea I have. It's, like Wagon Train to the Stars. It's called Star Trek." Gene sat anxiously in the chair near my desk and stared at me as I read his words on the wrinkled paper. Although inventive, it wasn't a totally new kind of television series. Years before, in the infancy of television, Channel 5, the old Dumont station in New York, telecast a live series called Captain Video. Soon after Captain Video came Space Rangers, and both the movies and television had covered the subject fairly well, especially with popular serials Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. However, while Gene Roddenberry's subject was familiar, the concept and characters he created and later defined and refined were compelling. And he'd solved one of the problems of audience familiarity by using contemporary Navy terms, ranks, names, and jargon. It was captain and yeoman and medical officer. It was starboard and port, and it was the USS Yorktown, later changed to the Enterprise, rather than rocket ship X-9. However, the Wagon Train to the Stars concept, while an ear-catching phrase, didn't work as conceived. It needed something else. But before I could say anything, Gene volunteered he'd written a complete presentation for a 1-hour dramatic action-adventure science fiction television series which included character breakdowns and story springboards. "I'd like to read it later," I told him, "but first, let's see if we can make a deal to develop your idea." Roddenberry stared at me quizzically. "You're kidding. You haven't read any of my writing." "Well, I've seen the way you dress," I countered, "and I figure you must be able to write. You sure as hell aren't going to make a living impressing employers with your wardrobe." I made a script development deal with Gene, and the process began. It was interrupted only once when Oscar Katz, in his anxiety to show activity to Lucy, had Gene pitch the series to CBS. It wasn't ready, and CBS passed. After that, I made it clear to everyone. First, we developed the series, then we pitched the networks. Gene and I met every day, just sitting around and talking about Star Trek. Gene was relatively inexperienced in the art of writing series presentations and very much needed someone to use as a sounding board. The continuing problem with Star Trek was the need to place it in a viewer-understandable time frame. Gene's pet metaphor for Star Trek, Wagon Train to the Stars, came from a very successful television series about a wagon train moving from St. Joseph, Missouri to Oregon during the 19th century migration to the American West. But that was a time and event most viewers knew from school or from the movies and accepted because it had already taken place. Star Trek, according to Gene's concept, was way out there in the future and was yet to happen. There was the possibility that the 1964 television audience wasn't going to accept that premise on a continuing series basis. Having studied Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels at college, I accepted what Swift wrote because he treated it as something that had already happened. Swift was merely telling me what had gone on, setting up and highlighting the adventure for me. My recommendation to Gene: the voyages of the Enterprise have already taken place. All Star Trek adventures are already history. The captain is setting up and recounting the particular adventure. He clues in the viewer very quickly as to what is going on and where, so we don't have page after page of boring exposition. It was an unusually quick way to deliver needed information using a flashback to move the action from past to present. We kicked the idea around for a while, and Gene accepted the concept. The Captain's Log Stardate introduction to each episode was born, and each adventure became a flashback. To commemorate the event, we went even further and changed the series title from Star Trek to Gulliver's Travels, and the name of the ship's captain to Captain Gulliver. Several days later, we met again. Gene looked at me in despair. I looked at him in despair. We had both come to the same conclusion. We had just gotten caught up in the moment and had gone too far. Narration, yes. Gulliver's Travels and Captain Gulliver, no. Rather than Trekkies, we would have had Gullies. Changing the name back was a wise move, and nowadays they're called Trekkers. With the ship's log, stardate concept in place, and the main characters more defined, the time had arrived to confront another network. NBC was the choice. Desilu had never had a series development with NBC, but having recently left NBC, the wannabe full-color network, I decided, with a series like Star Trek just begging for color, you can go home again. I called NBC Vice President Grant Tinker and set up a meeting. Jerry Stanley, NBC Program Development Vice President, would join Grant. Gene would join me. Gene and I discussed the pending meeting. I told him the more he was considered exotic, strange, and mysterious, the more the network would believe he knew about other planets, alien creatures, and benevolent monsters. So Gene was coming to the meeting having agreed to the following provisos. He would look unkempt, not a problem. He would mumble some, not a problem. And he would not volunteer anything, hopefully not a problem. In early May 1964, Gene and I drove to NBC Burbank for our meeting. I made the pitch explaining the series idea, the characters, and the stories. Gene was great. He sat there in some odd grinning stupor as if he were jet-lagged from the long voyage back from Alpha Centauri. Jerry Stanley wanted to know more about the pilot story. I asked Gene to explain. He did, very succinctly describing the premise of The Menagerie. But neither Grant Tinker nor Jerry was convinced it would make a commercial television series, that there was enough of an audience out there to support this mixture of science fiction and fantasy. It was, well, I really don't know time. Gene stood up to leave. I told him to sit down, and I turned to Jerry. Jerome, listen. There comes a time when you guys have to gamble on something that's worth the gamble. Sure, Star Trek is a gamble, but it's worth taking. It's also a gamble for Desilu, a big gamble. And if it doesn't work, we've all lost, but we've lost trying to do something worthwhile. And if you give us a commitment for a 90-minute script instead of 1 hour, and we make the pilot, then you can always run it as a TV special and recoup your investment if it doesn't sell as a series. Besides, Jerome, I'm not leaving this room until you give us a script order. I sat down as authoritatively as I could. So there we all sat, stubbornly waiting for a shoe to drop. Jerry broke the silence with a smile. Solo, you're a real pain in the ass. I know, I replied. Does that mean we have a deal, Jerome? He looked at Grant. Grant smiled. Jerry nodded. As Gene and I drove back to the studio, we marked the day as the beginning of Star Trek. We did not know it would take almost 3 years of anxiety and frustration before the Star Trek series would debut on NBC. Although I wasn't a member of the Desilu Board of Directors, I was called upon to make appearances at board meetings to report on and update our series development status, network deals, important casting choices we've made, and the like. Lucille Ball rarely asked questions during the meeting, content to listen to her executives discuss the state of her company. Surprisingly, at one particular meeting, as I was about to begin my presentation, Lucy interrupted me. Herb? Lucy? Herb, what's happening with that South Seas series? The what? You know, Herb, that South Seas series you mentioned last time. South Seas series? Gee, Lucy, I wish I could remember, but I don't recall any South Seas series. Are you sure? Herb, Lucy interrupted, a slight anger sounding in her tone. Of course you talked about a South Seas series, with the USO entertainers who went there during the war to visit the troops. I looked around the room. The faces of the board members weren't happy. Mickey Rudin, Lucy's attorney and my support system at Desilu, silently indicated for me to answer her question. I tried to be calm as Lucy was getting more and more upset. Lucy, perhaps it's something I've forgotten, but for the life of me I do not recall ever mentioning a series we have in development about a group of USO entertainers visiting our troops in the South Seas during World War II. Oh, yes, you did, now a defiant Lucy said. Oh, yes, you did. I stood speechless, trying for the life of me to remember what I'd obviously forgotten, when Lucy, having remembered more information on the subject, suddenly blurted out, "Oh, yes, you did, Herb. You called it Star Trek." Later, out of hearing of the others, I explained Star Trek to Lucy, and I realized what an honest and human mistake she'd made. After all, in Lucille Ball's world, a Star Trek could only mean movie stars traveling somewhere in the world for the USO to visit our troops. The South Seas was as good a place as any. NBC always had doubts as to whether or not the supposedly reborn Desilu could pull off something like Star Trek. They wanted to hear more stories before one of them was chosen as the basis for the pilot script. The pilot story NBC chose was named The Cage, and after we spent hours straightening out the twists, turns, and bends in the plot, Gene began to write the script. When the 2-hour pilot script was finally finished, NBC, the arch rival of Lucy's CBS, put its faith in the new Desilu and Star Trek and ordered a 90-minute pilot. But we had a problem. Desilu had the Lucy show production crew, period. As professional as the crew was, most of them would be of little help when confronted with the overwhelming demands and technical requirements of the planned Star Trek pilot. Basically, Gene and I were faced with the job of building a production unit from scratch. But first things first, we needed a director. We chose Robert Butler. If faced with the end of the world, cool, calm, and collected, he'd just keep on going about the business of directing. But since no one had ever attempted to film a complicated television script like The Cage, finding the key creative personnel was easier said than done. The production designer, art director, was the next key to the puzzle. Gene Roddenberry had written about the Starship Enterprise, but he was never able to visualize what the ship actually looked like. He had spent many hours with writer friend Sam Peoples looking through hundreds of old science fiction and fantasy magazines in an effort to visualize what the Enterprise should look like. And he finally took photos of the cover illustrations of some of the issues of Thrilling Wonder stories and other science fiction magazines dating back as far as 1931. A visual translator, however, was needed. While Pato Guzman, the under-challenged art director on the Lucy show, would design the sets, set designer Matt Jeffries, artist, designer, illustrator, and aviator, was given the assignment of designing the spaceship. All that Gene knew was what the Enterprise shouldn't look like. It shouldn't be a dinky Flash Gordon spaceship, and it shouldn't be rocket-powered. Rather, its power should be something as yet unimagined by present-day science. Given the tall order, Matt Jeffries made trip after trip to Gene's office with what he felt was the answer, and time after time returned to his drawing board until, at long last, they both agreed. Luckily, costume designer William Ware Tice was between assignments and available to us. An intense dabbler with fabric swatches, Tice was given the assignment of designing costumes that had to be different from anything ever seen on commercial television. Tice utilized the pictures of scantily clad women in pulp science fiction magazines like Amazing Stories and Astounding Stories as his point of departure. His costume designs permitted the actress to show as much leg, breast, and skin as possible while attempting to adhere to the dictates of NBC's Broadcast Standards Department, the network censors. If there's one thing a producer learns early in life, it's that his greatest need is a good associate producer to do the dirty work and ride herd on both the production and the post-production phases of the show. James Goldstone had directed an episode of Gene's MGM series, The Lieutenant, and incidentally, he would later direct the second Star Trek pilot. Gene called and asked him for an associate producer recommendation. Goldstone told Gene he was working on The Outer Limits with an assistant director named Bob Justman, who he thought was more than ready to move up to associate producer. Talk to Bob Justman. He's the one you want.
Jim Goldstone told me I would be getting a call from a guy named Gene Roddenberry. Jim said, "He's making a science fiction pilot and he's looking for a good associate producer." I lost my head and lied and told him, "You're the best." When Gene phoned, I agreed to meet with him during my lunch break. At Desilu, I found Gene in a small temporary office. He was alone. His secretary, Dorothy Fontana, had already gone to lunch. He rose to greet me and shook my hand. "Hi, Bob. I'm Gene Roddenberry." He was quite tall, and when he smiled, he was immediately likable. As Gene and I talked, I realized he had great intelligence. He spoke softly, philosophically. He asked me about myself, my career, what I wanted to do in the future, and what was important in my life. No one in the film business had ever asked me about what was important in my life. So I told him I wanted to use my creativity and contribute ideas rather than merely contributing my time and energy. After no more than 30 minutes, he asked if I'd be interested in the job of associate producer on his pilot. Interested? Try desperate. But I knew I lacked the sort of extensive post-production knowledge a show like this would demand. I explained that to Gene and turned down his offer. It wasn't much later that Herb Solow checked with producer and director friends around town about getting an assistant director for the first Star Trek pilot. My name came up, and Herb phoned me out of the blue. I'd never even heard of him before, and here he was, speaking to me as if he'd known me for years, and asking if I would like to be assistant director on the Star Trek pilot I had already turned down. I told Herb that I was busy preparing a feature and unavailable. His response? "No problem. I spoke to your boss. It's all arranged. So come by my office at Desilu tomorrow morning, say 9 o'clock. We can talk some more then, and I'll take you over to see Gene Roddenberry and your new office. Bye." So I went to work for Desilu on what I thought would take no more than 6 weeks. That would lengthen into more than 3 years on Star Trek, and a further stint on Star Trek The Next Generation more than 20 years later. The next morning I met Herb Solow for the first time. He was as breezy and informal in person as he had been on the phone. "Welcome aboard, RJ. I'm glad you're here. Now I can relax while you guys make the show. Remember, it's how you play the game and how you win." Upon hearing that, I liked him immediately, and we've been friends ever since. I had reservations as to how we could afford certain aspects of real space travel on a television budget and schedule. So before reading the script, I talked to Gene. Since there's no gravity in outer space, reality dictated that for the actors to give the appearance of floating in space, they would have to be flown on wires. Gene's solution? Artificial gravity. It solved the believability problem for me and also made it possible to film each episode in something less than a year's time. My other major worry was the enormous cost of optical effects to land the Enterprise on a new planet every week. Gene's clever solution? The transporter effect. Beaming people to other locations with no apparent loss of molecules, other than when required for story purposes. After I read the latest script rewrite of The Cage, I began the schedule and budget breakdown process. Not only was the film equivalent in length to any movie, it was replete with enormously difficult production challenges, special effects and optical shots that had never even been attempted on a television schedule and budget. There was a temporary setback in the art department when art director Pato Guzman left the project. Homesick, Pato returned to his native Chile. His replacement was a veteran art director, German-born Franz Boschlin. But the design process continued. Designer Matt Jeffries worked closely with Boschlin and not only designed the main Enterprise set, the bridge, but also designed the various consoles and readout screens in the Enterprise sets. The Howard Anderson Company, a tenant on the Desilu lot, was to handle all Star Trek special optical effects. With final approval of the Enterprise design from a well-pleased Gene Roddenberry, the detailed plans were given to the inventive Darrell Anderson and his crew of model makers to build the miniature vessel. Some miniature. At almost 14 feet in length, its size would create problems in filming, but not because the model was difficult to move through a shot. The model wasn't supposed to move. It was the camera that moved, and therein lay the problem. The model was so large and took up so much of the Anderson Company's miniature stage that camera movement was severely limited. When I first viewed the transporter effect, I was as curious as anyone else might be and asked Darrell Anderson how he achieved it. Darrell said, I just turned a slow-motion camera upside down and photographed some backlit shiny grains of aluminum powder that we dropped between the camera and a black background. And, using a piece of composer Sandy Courage shimmer music, we gave the visual effect its distinctive sound. Fortune smiled on us as director of photography Bill Snyder, a superior cameraman, became available and, as was the custom in the industry, brought his own camera crew and lighting gaffer with him. Although Jerry Finnerman, the first director of photography on the series, has been erroneously credited in other books as the camera operator on this first pilot, the actual camera operator was Dick Kelly, and I still have the original crew sheet from the first pilot to prove it. It was apparent that we needed the best makeup man we could find. I'd worked with Fred Phillips on several television series, the latest of which had been The Outer Limits, a series that required scads of special makeups and prosthetics. Fred would design and build, or have built in a makeup lab run by special makeup creator John Chambers, the ears for Mr. Spock, ears that would become famous.
Surprisingly, the casting process for The Cage was not a difficult one. I was thrilled that we were able to get Jeffrey Hunter to star as Captain Christopher Pike. Incidentally, in Gene's original pitch to me, the captain's name was Robert April. Hunter had appeared in over 20 movies, including The Longest Day, The Last Hurrah, and John Ford's The Searchers. Leonard Nimoy, a struggling actor who had worked on The Lieutenant for Gene, was the one Gene wanted to play the alien Mr. Spock. His brooding face and introspective appearance were perfectly suited to that mysterious character. But early on, Nimoy had misgivings about the ears he would have to wear. He did not want to be perceived as a television freak, and didn't want to end up in a career dead end, typecast as an actor who could only play weird roles. DeForest Kelley was at the top of Gene's list for the role of the ship's doctor, but director Bob Butler had recently seen the much-traveled and better-known actor John Hoyt perform at a Shakespeare festival. Butler was impressed. John Hoyt got the role. Gene raised no objections. Susan Oliver, one of Hollywood's really nice and talented people, was set as the guest star and love interest for Jeffrey Hunter. Her role included several manifestations, one of which was Vina, the green-skinned alien dancing girl. Gene wanted to co-star Majel Barrett as number 1, second in command of the Enterprise. She had worked for him at MGM. "You'll like her, Herb," Gene insisted. "She's solid." Since Gene couldn't be moved relative to this little-known actress, I went along with his request, devised some obtuse sales pitch, and met with NBC to try to sell the notion. NBC program executive Jerry Stanley stared quizzically at NBC Vice President Grant Tinker. Then Jerry grumbled, "Christ, Herb, this is madness. She's his girlfriend. I remember her hanging around Gene's office at MGM when he was doing the lieutenant for us." The simple truth is that NBC resented being put into such an awkward position. But in the end, Grant and Jerry didn't want to rock the boat with Gene. Majel was cast as number 1, the USS Enterprise executive officer, playing opposite Jeffrey Hunter's Captain Christopher Pike.
The Cage was scheduled to be filmed at Desilu's antiquated Culver City studio, Desilu Culver, because of its large stages and proximity to the famous 40 acres backlot where Atlanta burned in Gone with the Wind. In setting a shooting date, I had convinced everyone it was safer to begin production on a Friday rather than a Monday, so that the cast and crew, unused to that great unknown science fiction, could get their feet wet for a day and then collapse over the weekend. Principal photography would begin on Friday, November 27, 1964, and was scheduled to finish 11 working days later on Friday, December 11th. I had suggested to Gene and Herb that 3 days of rehearsals with director Bob Butler and the cast would pay off in a better product. Cast rehearsals began on Monday, November 23, 1964. Then came Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. And next would come Friday, Magic Time, the first shooting day. A few days prior to the Thanksgiving Day holiday, cameraman Bill Snyder, his gaffer Bob Campbell, and the electrical crew began to pre-light the planet set on Stage 16, the largest stage at Desilu Culver. The set was encircled by a huge backing painted green to simulate an alien planet sky. On Wednesday night, after 2 days spent pouring light onto the green sky backing, Snyder and Campbell complained, "No matter how much light we throw on it, it's never enough, Bob. That damn green backing just soaks it all up. If this is the way it's going to be when we're actually in production, you can kiss your damn shooting schedule goodbye." This was definitely not what I wanted to hear. Campbell patted me on the back. "We're already on overtime, Bob, so we're going home now. See you Friday morning, and have a nice Thanksgiving." The painted sky problem later sparked me to an innovative idea should the series ever sell. But for now, I worried about what else Murphy's Law would bring to this bedeviled production. My Thanksgiving Day holiday was already ruined. I didn't want the same thing to occur on Christmas. Magic time had finally arrived. Without a foot of film exposed, the pilot was already over budget. Star Trek was just hours away from birth. Everything was ready. We'd had a final dress rehearsal for camera. Filming would begin with a dialogue scene in the captain's quarters set. The actors, Jeff Hunter and John Hoyt, were in position. The camera was loaded with film. We had placed wig-wag red lights outside the stage to warn visitors not to come in when we were shooting, and to warn passing truck drivers on the studio street to kill their engines so the noise wouldn't ruin our soundtracks. "Quiet, please. This will be a take," I announced. Everything became very still on the stage when I ordered camera and sound to roll for our first shot. But we hadn't counted on. Slim Horton, our sound mixer, ripped off his headphones and looked around. Everyone looked around. "What's that?" Director Bob Butler asked me. "Sounds like pigeons, Bob. In the rafters. I think they live here." Butler was a gentle soul. "Well, ask them to be quiet." I deployed some pigeon herders up high, but the pesky critters just moved to another rafter every time someone came close. Next morning I was prepared for pigeons. We left the big stage doors open and scattered a mess of stale bread, bird seed, Cracker Jacks, whatever, on the studio street outside. By the time we'd finished lighting for the first shot, most of the pigeons were already outside, chowing down. I looked at Bob Butler. He nodded, ready. I yelled, "This'll be a take. Quiet, please," and then, "Roll it." And the filming process began. Sound mixer Slim Horton yelled, "Speed." Camera operator Dick Kelly yelled, "Marker." And Bob Butler said quietly, "Action." Someone was hammering inside the next-door stage. I ran outside and burst in there yelling, "Red light on, no hammer. Red light off, hammer." I was sure they understood now. Scattering pigeons, I raced back onto the shooting stage. "Quiet," I yelled, screeching to a stop. "Roll it." "Speed." "Marker." "Action." Someone, somewhere, flushed the toilet, and the pipes rattled. I raced outside again and found the culprit. The woman in the ladies' room was not amused. So, red lights were placed on both the men's and ladies' facilities to warn people when we were on a take. Problem solved. I returned to the set and rolled camera again. The red lights in the restrooms didn't solve our problem. When you gotta go, you gotta go. So toilet monitors were deployed outside the stage lavatories. Things went along pretty well after that. Finally, we moved to the stage next door and prepared to film our next shot. This stage had no bathrooms attached. Things were looking up. Everyone was in place. I looked at Butler. "Okay, Bob?" He nodded. "Roll it." "Speed." "Marker." "What is that?" asked Director Butler. "Sounds like bees," I said. "I guess they live here too and have for a long time. Remember, this is an old studio. It's where they burned the city of Atlanta for Gone with the Wind." That night, a beekeeper was brought in, and the problem was solved. As I've already mentioned, we were on a very tight budget. We discovered we couldn't afford to build the main Telosian set the way we'd like to. It demanded lots of scope, and we didn't have the space or the money for it. I thought about it overnight and then held a meeting. "I've got the answer, guys. Midgets. Okay, Bob, the answer is midgets, replied Herb Solo. So tell me, what's the question? We use forced perspective. Matt builds the set smaller and smaller as it goes away from camera. And then we use midgets at the back of the set. Get it? Art director Matt Jeffries seized the concept and ran with it. He built a full-scale set in the foreground that diminished in size until it was quite small at the back. To make the idea work, we used the Toulousian actors in the foreground and Toulousian midgets in the rear, one of whom was famous for having had a small role in The Wizard of Oz. But while the shot looked great, it was never used in the final version of the film. Another problem was Spock's ears. Fred Phillips, the makeup man, had taken a cast of Leonard's ears from which he had molds made that incorporated the kind of pointed tips that Gene Roddenberry wanted. The theory was that, once the molds were made, duplicate ears could be cranked out when needed and glued onto Leonard's ears. Easier said than done. Once a pair of them had been painstakingly attached and colored to match the rest of Spock's yellowish complexion, that was it for that pair. Removal was a painful and time-consuming process for Leonard, since they were attached with spirit glue and could be removed only with the use of strong solvent. And, once removed, they couldn't be saved for use the next time. New day, new ears. And when Fred Phillips first applied them to Leonard, a new problem arose. Leonard looked like a bus coming down the street with his doors open. His ears stuck way out. Freddie had to pull them back to the sides of Leonard's head with double-faced wig tape. That finally did the trick. And for the entire run of the series, that's how it was done. Gene had cast small-boned women to play the Toulousians, captors of our brave captain and his damsel in distress. The Toulousians were weak-looking humanoids with enormous craniums. Actress Meg Wiley portrayed the chief Toulousian, known as the Keeper. Large veins traversed the Keeper's skull, and they pulsated as she spoke. Now, in reality, the Keeper's veins were airtight and connected to a tube behind and below her neck which, concealed by the costume she wore, led down her back to the bottom of her gown and then up to a rubber squeeze bulb. When the bulb was compressed and released, air pressure inside the system caused the veins to expand and contract. I hid below camera while Meg was being photographed, manipulating the pulsating veins of the Keeper's oversized head in time with the Keeper's dialogue. Gene Roddenberry wanted Star Trek to cover new ground, and he sensed the importance of convincing the audience that what they were seeing was actually happening in this strange new world of the future. One of the many creative and thought-provoking ideas he employed was to have a male voice emanating from a female character. He did this with the Keeper by revoicing her previously recorded dialogue to make it sound masculine. Incidentally, did you ever ask yourself, how were those Enterprise guys able to communicate with different alien creatures each and every week? Well, I did. The answer was simple. Enter the Universal Translator. You couldn't see it, you couldn't hear it, but you could depend upon it. And you could also forget about it, which is what we did soon after the device was introduced.
And suddenly, it was still. No actors, no technicians, no makeup problems, no pigeons, no bees, nothing. The Star Trek cast and crew had done what the studio asked them to do. They took their well-earned salaries and went on to their next assignments. Butler, Roddenberry, and I remained as the custodians and protectors of tens of thousands of feet of 35mm picture negative, positive work prints, and soundtracks. A team of picture editors worked on the process under the guidance of Bob Butler. Quickly arriving at the final cut, the next step was to score the film while waiting for the completion of the much-needed optical film effects. Wilbur Hatch, Lucy's musical director, came to us with a suggestion, volunteering the name of an arranger-composer working at 20th Century Fox Studios, Alexander Courage. Sandy Courage and his contributions to Star Trek have never received the plaudits they truly deserved. Sandy, though not at all a fan of science fiction, wrote a truly exciting score that magnified both the adventure of outer space and the mysteries that lay somewhere in that beyond. But Sandy's brilliance lay in arranging and orchestrating his main title theme music. Rather than relying upon a man-made musical instrument, Sandy placed a soaring human voice, that of soprano Lulie Jean Norman, just above the orchestra. It created an ethereal human quality and sent it out into the galaxy as if opening a door of welcome to one and all who might be out there, listening, watching. Gene often spoke of his idea of giving planets their own personality by arranging for the exterior of the planet Talos, for example, to have a high-pitched, wavering sound. The concept of a musical sound for planet surfaces, however, actually came from composer Sandy Courage. Courage proposed that the noises of distant planets and planet surfaces would be more unusual if they came from music rather than sound effects. He assembled 5 musicians on a recording stage at Glen Sound Studios and recorded both individual instruments and the assorted combination of instruments. The result of his efforts made the sounds of the galaxy not only unique, but almost human. Another Sandy Courage contribution, and a very personal one at that, is heard in the series' main title. Gene and the sound editors were having great difficulty finding an acceptable sound effect for the fast flybys of the Enterprise. Always the ingenious one, Courage picked up a microphone and made several whooshing sounds into it. The recordings of his whooshings were laid into the main title and synchronized with the passage of the ship. They were perfect, even though there really is no sound in outer space. The reaction to the pilot from the old guard at Desilu can best be described as haltingly neutral. But the real world was calling. The Cage, the Star Trek pilot, was ready to be screened by the NBC executives who would decide whether the show that sprung from Gene's original wrinkled piece of paper would fly as a weekly television series or disappear into failed pilot oblivion as a midsummer movie of the week. The NBC party line was that The Cage was too cerebral. The unspoken reason, however, dealt more with the manners and morals of mid-1960s America. NBC was very concerned with the eroticism of the pilot and what it foreshadowed for the ensuing series. Their knowledge of Gene's attitude toward and relationship with the fairer sex didn't help. NBC Sales was equally concerned with the Mr. Spock character, he being seen as demonic by Bible Belt affiliate station owners and important advertisers. But NBC did not forsake us. Soon after the fall schedule was set, we met again. Mort Werner, NBC program head, Grant, and Jerry were still taken by what we'd accomplished. And Mort had a complaint. "Herb, you guys gave us a problem." "Sorry, Mort. We tried our best." "That's the problem, Herb. I didn't think Desilu was capable of making Star Trek, so when we looked over the pilot stories you gave us, we chose the most complicated and most difficult one of the bunch. We recognize now it wasn't necessarily a story that properly showcased Star Trek's series potential. So, the reason the pilot didn't sell was my fault, not yours. You guys just did your job too well, and, well, I screwed up." I shook my head in awe. No, this wasn't a network executive talking to me. This was the Good Witch of the East come to lay gold at my feet. Oz had a Good Witch of the South, I know, but I was from New York. I conjured up all my good thoughts. "So, Mort, let's do another pilot." "That's exactly why we're here." "But there's no such thing as a free lunch or a free pilot order," Mort announced NBC's wants and desires. "In varying degrees, we're not too happy with some of the cast. While we support the concept of a woman in a strong leading role, we have serious doubts as to Majel Barrett's abilities to carry the show as its co-star. We also think you can do better with the ship's doctor, the yeoman, and the other members of the crew. We applaud the attempt at a racial mix. It's exactly what we want. Jeffrey Hunter was okay. If you want to use him again, that's fine with us. Leonard Nimoy isn't a problem, but the role he plays is a major problem. Though the Mr. Spock character is interesting and probably has potential, its inclusion in our new pilot could possibly keep Star Trek off the air as a series. And one last thing, Herb. For God's sake, no more scantily clad green dancing girls with bumps and grinds. Okay? So we were still alive. I filled Gene in on my meeting, and he was thrilled with the rebirth, especially the guaranteed pilot film. And we made a decision. Majel had to go. Despite NBC's position, both Gene and I were adamant about Mr. Spock. The character was a huge plus. Gene wanted to get cracking writing 3 new 1-hour scripts, but there wasn't enough time for one person to write all of them. I also wanted the diversity which other writers would bring to the project. Gene finally agreed, as long as he discussed his story ideas with the writers and he could write one of the scripts. Contrary to the NBC research recommendation for an action-adventure script, Gene took his own Omega Glory story and would write the script. Steve Kandel, a quality writer, met with Gene. Gene wanted a sort of swashbuckling character as the guest lead, and they thrashed around various story concepts. Several weeks later, Kandel returned with his version of Gene's story idea called Mud's Women, and after discussions with Gene, proceeded to write his script. Though he enjoyed working with Gene, Steve Kandel very much disliked his continual rewriting. As Steve Kandel remembers, I told him I'd polish my own script, but Gene always hemmed and hawed about how he just wanted to change a few minor things. When screen credits were submitted to the Writers Guild for approval, Gene Roddenberry took credit for Steve Kandel's story. Sam Peoples was the writer whom Gene consulted while researching the first pilot, The Cage. As Peoples relates, Gene was particularly pleased with me for introducing him to the works of many science fiction writers, not the least of whom were Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov. We discussed Heinlein's Space Cadet, which became the basis for Star Trek Starfleet, and I loaned him my personal copy of Olaf Stapledon's Last and First Men, as Gene was particularly interested in future history. Gene, continuing to seek both Sam Peoples' guidance and use of his voluminous research library, contracted with him to write the third script. Arguably the most experienced science fiction writer of the three, Sam discussed concepts with Gene and devised his own story. He enjoyed working with Gene and welcomed his continual rewriting. After viewing the completed pilot, however, Sam Peoples preferred his original version of the script to the one that was filmed. When credits were submitted to the Writers Guild for approval, Gene did not take credit for the story. Later, there was some discussion regarding who had originated the title Where No Man Has Gone Before. Sam Peoples states unequivocally that he, not Gene Roddenberry, wrote the phrase as the title to his own story, and I know that to be a fact. Sam Peoples' script, Where No Man Has Gone Before, was an action-adventure story with science fiction overtones. It personified NBC's expectations for the pilot. The new captain, soon to be named Kirk, was heroic and valiantly fought to the finish against crew members who had developed demonic powers. Mr. Spock was present, but not too importantly. The script called for shots of the Enterprise bridge pulsating with futuristic bells and whistles and shots of the ever-evolving galaxy. The transporter effect and the handheld communicators, originally called transicators, were both still there. The action-adventure story was light years away from being too cerebral. And not even the most conservative of conservatives would characterize the female guest star role, later performed by Sally Kellerman, as being too erotic. We had an option on Jeff Hunter for a series, but not for another pilot film. But Gene and I hoped we could convince Jeff to do the second pilot. We waited in the Desilu projection room for Jeff to arrive. He never did. Arriving in his stead was actress Sandy Bartlett, Mrs. Jeff Hunter. We traded hellos, and I nodded to Gene. He flicked the projection booth intercom switch. Let's go. And so it went. As the end credits rolled and the lights came up, Jeff Hunter's wife gave us our answer. This is not the kind of show Jeff wants to do, and besides, it would not be good for his career. Jeff Hunter is a movie star. Mrs. Hunter was very polite and very firm. She said her goodbyes and left, having surprisingly and swiftly removed our star from our new pilot. Well, boys and girls, we weren't left with much of our cast. no star, no number one, our demonic alien, Mr. Spock in serious question, no ship's doctor, no yeoman, and our only ethnic actor due for replacement. The actor agents at the Ashley Famous Agency were already making quality recommendations as to Jeff Hunter's replacement. William Shatner was among the suggestions. Gene and I screened a marvelous episode from Rod Serling's Twilight Zone series and a low-budget feature film that starred Bill Shatner. The feature was Roger Corman's The Intruder. Interestingly enough, the film had been written by Richard Matheson, later to write the Star Trek episode The Enemy Within. The Intruder also featured the acting debut of George Clayton Johnson, soon to become a writer and later to write the Star Trek episode Mantrap. So in this way came the first unprecedented resurrection of Star Trek, a new, shorter, less creatively fulfilling second pilot with major changes in both cast and crew. The process of making the pilot began all over again. But this time, we hired Bob Justman to be associate producer, as well as assistant director to director James Goldstone.
Jimmy Goldstone was one of the few directors who not only welcomed my suggestions, but actually used them. I was thrilled that he would direct the second pilot. Oddly enough, as late as a month prior to filming William Shatner in his role as the new captain of the Enterprise, the character's name was still up for grabs. Gene came up with some ideas and invited suggestions from his associates. Then he sent a short list to researcher Kellum DeForest's office and asked for the 16 possibilities to be checked out and cleared for use in the show. The name Kirk was next to last, followed by the penciled-in name North. In the late 60s and early 70s, two of the most popular and commercially successful motion pictures were MASH and 2001: A Space Odyssey. Among the stars of those films were Hot Lips Sally Kellerman and astronaut Gary Lockwood. And in the summer of 1965, the two guest stars of the second Star Trek pilot were Sally Kellerman and Gary Lockwood, whose characters during the story's development mutated into godhood. Gene was still looking for the right actor to play the ship's doctor. During the casting for the first pilot, Gene wanted DeForest Kelley, but was talked out of it by Bob Butler. Once again, with the second pilot, Gene had the chance to push DeForest Kelley. When the veteran actor Paul Fix was recommended for the part by director James Goldstone, Gene once again pulled back and accepted the decision of his director.
When casting was discussed with Gene, the only performers he would stand up for were the actresses with whom he'd had a previous personal relationship, Majel Barrett, Nichelle Nichols, and Grace Lee Whitney. After the casting of Fix, I told Gene, too bad DeForest Kelley hadn't been born a woman. A part of the Star Trek legend advanced by Gene Roddenberry and quoted numerous times by D. Kelley is that NBC turned Kelley down for both pilot films and finally relented after seeing him in Gene's unsold pilot for Police Story. Let me correct the record and assure D that at no time did NBC reject him for the role of ship's doctor, because his name was never submitted for either of the pilots. As a matter of principle, NBC promoted racially integrated casting in all its shows. Gene and I were in full agreement with NBC, and many African-American actors were interviewed. Lloyd Haynes, later star of Room 222, caught everyone's attention. So Haynes was one of the first African-American actors hired to play an important role in a network television pilot. The 1-hour length of the pilot and the relative simplicity of the script exposed a major crack in the Star Trek armor. Gene Roddenberry, Sam Peoples, and I soon realized the shortcoming. Other than Kirk, Spock, and the guest stars, the other characters, particularly the projected series regulars that Gene had placed aboard the Enterprise, were boring and bland and had absolutely nothing to do but occupy chairs on the ship's bridge. Gene reverted to his Navy analogy and pulled several distinctive characters from his old-time movie memories. One of them was the ship's irascible engineering officer. James Goldstone had directed Canadian-born actor James Doohan and recalled Doohan's marvelous facility for dialects. Doohan read and got the part. Another distinctive role was the strong and always dependable ship's helmsman. but the actual casting was very unusual for its time. George Takei, a second-generation Japanese-American, was set to portray Sulu. Actually, the name Sulu resulted from Jeem's decision to honor me, Herb Solo, by using a mispronunciation of my name without the W.
Magic time was closing in on me again. Of my remaining pre-production duties, one of the most important was to obtain silver eyes for Sally Kellerman and Gary Lockwood. The script called for their characters to mutate into all-powerful, godlike creatures, the outward signs of which would be their normal eyes transformed into shiny, silver-colored orbs. I phoned around only to find that a few optical houses still made old-fashioned scleral lenses that covered the entire eyeball, but not one of them wanted to undertake the difficult and possibly lawsuit-provoking task. One firm gave me the name of the Roberts Optical Company, stating, "If John Roberts can't make them, no one can." When I called him about silver eyes, John Roberts was incredulous, but when I arrived at his Beverly Hills office, he already had a sample pair of silver eyes waiting. "Stayed up the whole damn weekend working on this," he grumbled. "I had to crumple up tinfoil and laminate it between the two outer layers. See?" "Yes," I said. "They're real silver-looking, all right. Tell me, how are the actors going to see through them?" "See through them? You didn't say anything about seeing through them," he growled. "It wouldn't take much, though, just a small hole in the tinfoil. You'd never notice it unless you look for it. Come back Wednesday." I did, but now came the tough part. Roberts told me the lenses could be dangerous. "Dangerous?" I asked. "Damn right," he said. "You wear things this thick for any length of time, heat builds up in the eyeballs behind the lenses, and it gets damn uncomfortable. Painful, in fact." So I tried them on. As John had said, they were damn uncomfortable, but they could be worn, and I could see with them on. Not well, but well enough to navigate. Eureka! We had our silver eyes. I arranged appointments for Sally Kellerman and Gary Lockwood to be fitted for the lenses. Sally's fittings went just fine. But Gary Lockwood was a whole nother story. His fitting took a long time. Later, on stage, after much fussing, he'd finally managed to get the lenses in between his eyelids and his eyeballs, but he could hardly see while wearing them. In order to have any vision at all, Gary had to raise his chin and look down his nose at the other actor in the shot. Happily, this gave him an unearthly appearance that worked well for his character and even helped his godlike progression. It was getting uncomfortably close to magic time, and my last important duty was to find a top-flight cameraman to photograph the show. Unfortunately, the first pilot's cameraman, Bill Snyder, was busy elsewhere. I called the cameraman's union and was told the list was empty. They had no one available. This was not welcome news to Herb. "Listen, R.J., how can there be no cameramen? Can you see me calling Mort Werner and telling him we're such a dumb studio we can't even locate a dumb cameraman to shoot the dumb pilot? Don't worry, Herb. The union said they'd search the bars and old age homes and would call if and when they found anyone." I had already learned how to relieve Herb's tension. Jim Goldstone wanted an experienced cameraman, someone who had photographed complicated films. He recalled an old-timer he once knew, now probably retired, and suggested I check him out. The next day I got a message. The union had located Goldstone's old-timer. A graying-haired man named Ernest Haller showed up in my office. Gene and Herb sat in on the interview. Haller seemed nice, but I knew nothing about him. I was getting worried. Should we be wasting time with this guy when I should be out beating the bushes to find a cameraman? After the usual amenities, Herb broke the ice. "Ernie, could you tell us what you've done recently?" Haller took a long time to respond. "Not much. I've been sort of semi-retired." "Sort of semi-retired?" I asked. Now I was very worried. Herb was persistent. "Well, Ernie, have you done anything that, we might have heard of?" "Well, yes. I did do a picture you might have heard of. Back in '39. Herb and I looked at each other. We both quickly calculated. Let's see, it's now 1965. If he's talking 1939, that's 26 years ago. Then it was Ernie Haller's turn to break the ice. It was called Gone with the Wind, he said. "Oh, that's right, I almost forgot," said Herb. "Listen, guys, if it's all right with you, I think we ought to—" Gene jumped in. "I couldn't agree more, Herb." "Same here," I overlapped. "Can you come to work tomorrow, Ernie?" So Ernest Haller was hired on the spot to film the second Star Trek pilot. And he filmed it at Desilu Culver, the same lot that had once been owned by famed producer David O. Selznick, the same lot where 26 years earlier Haller had worked on Gone with the Wind. Finally, magic time came again, and shooting began on Monday, July 19, 1965.
Gene, Jimmy Goldstone, Bob Justman, and I viewed every previous day's work in the projection room. Shatner's portrayal of the ship's captain was exactly what Gene had been looking for, and Leonard Nimoy, now portraying both science officer and the ship's second-in-command, brought a heightened sense of mystery to the supposedly unemotional Mr. Spock. While the new characters of Engineer Scott and Helmsman Sulu worked well, the ship's doctor role, played by Paul Fix, did not ring true for Gene Roddenberry. He told me that if Star Trek became a series, he would come up with the right person for the role. He still had DeForest Kelley in mind. The NBC research department concept tested Star Trek just as they did all their pilot films. The tests were performed by a Los Angeles-based independent research company and took place at Preview House, basically a large theater fitted with individual dials that the audience manipulated during the screenings of a pilot on a like or dislike basis. The dials were connected directly to a computer that segmented the audience on the basis of sex and age groups. A master readout indicated the audience's fluctuating opinion of the pilot being tested, with an overall score at the conclusion of the film. There were small group discussions held after the screenings, but a bad computer score almost always resulted in a pilot not being recommended for the fall schedule. Before a pilot was tested, there was an established routine at Preview House. Every test showing began with the same Mr. Magoo cartoon, which was a research standard test to determine whether or not the audience was an average one. Star Trek was tested in the afternoon before an audience of, as I later complained, little old ladies with blue hair. The test was a disaster. Having worked in daytime programming, I complained angrily to program and research executives at NBC, demanding a retest before a nighttime audience when husbands are home from work and the kids are out of school. To NBC's credit, they acquiesced. Star Trek was retested at night. The results were considerably better and indicated substantial audience interest in science fiction action-adventure, especially in the 16 to 35-year-old group. Overjoyed with the retest results, I packed up Star Trek and Mission Impossible, the CBS pilot Desilu had developed with Bruce Geller, and flew east for PSR, the annual pilot season ritual. It was a great trip. I sold them both, Mission Impossible to CBS and Star Trek to NBC. Now that I'd sold them, I had to figure out two things. One, how to actually make them, especially Star Trek. And the second, and equally important, whether Lucille Ball was prepared to financially and emotionally support their production. I returned from New York to Los Angeles late at night and left for Desilu at 6 the following morning. When I arrived, Bob Justman, of course, was already there, patiently standing by the Desilu drive-in gate. His arms were full of schedules and budgets. Bob asked me, "Did you tell NBC how much time it takes to put on Leonard's ears every morning and do all the weird makeups and hairdos?" I shook my head. "Did you tell them Desilu was the worst-equipped studio in town?" I shook my head. "Did you tell them anything?" he asked. "I thanked them for their orders and said they could depend on us," I replied with a smile. Convincing Lucy and the Desilu Board of Directors wasn't as easy. The old guard made its position quite clear. It wasn't a difficult position for them to take, considering the high cost of both pilots. Simply put, don't let Solo and the rest of the crazies loose. Things are good. Things could get worse. Don't give the inmates the key to the asylum. Before the board meeting, however, I'd laid it out to Lucy. You'll always have a show with the same actors, the same staff, the same people to write and direct. Everyone will be happy. The studio will keep renting space to other shows, so fame isn't a problem and money isn't a problem. But wouldn't you like to rebuild Desilu's prestige, importance, and value as a major player? Wouldn't it be great to have 2 exciting and successful Desilu television shows on the air? So it was up to the third Lucy. Forget about Lucy Ricardo's Vitamita regimens and those chocolates coming down the conveyor belt and Lucy crushing grapes with her feet. Forget Ricky Ricardo and his Babalu band. Don't even think about Fred and Ethel Mertz. Forget all the fluff about President Lucy, the brilliant executive, the Hollywood mogul. On this day, she could be the real Lucy, the one who respected talent, hated confrontation, and held the future of a lot of people in her grasp. Say yes, Lucy, and we'll all go to work. Lucy nodded, and we all went to work. The inmates had the key to the asylum. It felt great to be publicly stamped approved, to proceed directly to go and collect $200, to watch Desilu return to the winner's circle. But worrywart Bob Justman continued to accept the news with mixed emotions, joy and fear. Joy that he'd be the associate producer in the strange new world of Star Trek, and fear that he was going, as Bob put it, where no associate producer had ever gone before.
One of the first things I did, with Gene's approval, was to hire Gerald Perry Finnerman as Star Trek's director of photography. To make sure Jerry would give the show the kind of look I envisioned, dramatic lighting and camera angles that were creatively unique, I encouraged him to free himself from the tired techniques of the past. We're all in outer space, Jerry, and we're in color. NBC claims to be the first full-color network, so let's prove it for them. When you light the sets, throw wild colors in, magenta, red, green, any color you can find, especially behind the actors when they're in a close shot. Be dramatic. In fact, go overboard. Backlight the women and make them more beautiful. Take some chances. Nobody can tell you that's not the way the future will look. How can they? They ain't been there yet. Jerry did just what was asked of him. Any doubts about hiring him disappeared when I saw the results of his work on the second episode he photographed, Mudd's Women. Guest stars Karen Steele, Maggie Threat, and Susan Denberg, good-looking in real life, looked even more radiantly lovely and ravishing as they worked their magic upon Captain Kirk and crew after Jerry worked his magic upon the 3 actresses. Desilu production vice president Argyle Nelson wanted Star Trek to be made on the home lot in Hollywood so he could keep a close eye on the production. I agreed wholeheartedly. The facilities and equipment were better at the Hollywood plant. We squeezed enough money from the budget to pay for one major new permanent set, the engine room of the Starship Enterprise. Knowing that a large set was required and hurting for lack of stage space on Stage 8, we turned to forced perspective once more. Matt Jeffries designed the set with a heavy screen separating the foreground work area from the ship's massive engines in the background. Behind the screen, the engine conduits were large closest to camera and tapered radically to a much smaller size in the rear. The film crew used pulsating reddish lighting in the background, which emanated from the energy generated by what appeared to be an enormous power plant, just so long as it was photographed from the proper angle. Matt Jeffries' last big task was to satisfy my request for a planet set on Stage 9 next door that could be used to simulate alien planet exteriors. Jeffries built a planet surface consisting of tons of sand, dozens of bogus rocks that could be moved easily, and, yet another forced perspective, a range of mini mountains that encircled the set on 3 sides. Examples of the technique can be found in such episodes as Man Trap, The Deadly Years, Amok Time, and Metamorphosis. As long as the camera was kept low, the mountains behind the actors looked realistic. I cautioned all directors to keep the camera lens well below eye height, but sometimes a director either forgot or elected to ignore this stricture, and the actors appeared taller than the mountains behind them, throwing the viewer's suspension of disbelief into total disarray. To color the sky of the planet set without the need to paint a new sky each time, we hung a neutral white backing which surrounded the planet set and was illumined by permanently placed lamps. The lighting passed through colored filters called gels, and created planet skies of various hues that were selected for each episode. Painting with light was a lot cheaper than painting with paint, and the odor of burning gels sure helped clear the sinuses. Matt Jefferies' ingenuity paid off in uniquely creative ways. To give the impression that Captain Kirk and crew were really beaming down to strange new worlds and alien planets, doorways were never rectangular. They were always triangular or trapezoidal or somehow weirdly shaped. Doors never swung open. Instead, they slid up or sideways. They didn't slide down because that would entail excavating a hole in the stage floor, and financially that was totally out of the question. Due to Gene's continued prodding, Jefferies designed the ship's sick bay to include fully monitored hospital beds that automatically kept track of the afflicted patient's condition and displayed the readouts such as heartbeat, blood pressure, temperature, and respiration, much as modern-day intensive care modules do today. Jefferies also came up with a design for a small phaser weapon that could snap into a larger phaser pistol when added range and power were required. Then I called Hua Chang and Gene Warren at Project Unlimited, the prop design and manufacturing house that had supplied the Outer Limits TV series with many of its special props and creatures. Gene Warren handled the business end of things, and Hua Chang was an extremely talented sculptor who designed and fabricated whatever wild creatures or props were needed. Project Unlimited had designed and constructed the Telosian heads in the first pilot, and would later create the Balok effigy for the Corbomite maneuver, the salt-sucking monster for Mantrap, and the reptilian Gorn adversary fought by Kirk in Arena. In Star Trek's second season, their most beloved creatures were the prolific but cute, furry little critters in The Trouble with Tribbles. Hua Chang also designed and built the famous flip-open communicators used by Kirk and Company when they beamed down from the ship to the planet below, and the medical tricorder used by Dr. McCoy. I gave Matt's detailed working drawings of the phaser pistol to Hua Chang. He finished everything perfectly. When you think of Star Trek props, you also have to think of Irving Feinberg, the show's beloved property master, who actually came from Desilu. Necessity was the mother of invention on Star Trek. Someone would yell, "Props! We need that new Feinberg for the next scene," and Irving, usually dressed in his trademark baggy shorts that displayed his knobby knees, or his assistant Al Jacoby, would come running with it. Since no one could ever remember the names of the various gadgets Irving put together, they were all called Feinbergs. When a new prop was needed, Irving had to create it. Dr. McCoy's scalpel was one of a pair of slim, triangular, Swedish modern salt and pepper shakers that Irving bought in the May Company basement. After operating on his patient, McCoy would use the same device to seamlessly suture the incision. It had been early March 1966 when NBC gave us a go-ahead for the fall series. Unfortunately, due to Star Trek's particular and peculiar writing demands, the day we were picked up, we instantly fell 3 months behind schedule. We had no scripts, much less stories, but the September air date to premiere our new series was immovable. Without scripts, we were nowhere. So not only did we need writers, we needed them yesterday. And yesterday was already gone.
As is the practice with new television series seeking to hire writers, all major talent agencies, independent writers' agents, and Gene's writer friends were notified that the successful second pilot was being screened. Those writers who did show up expectantly filed into a Desilu projection room to see what all the fuss was about. The Star Trek pilot screening was interrupted as the projection room door opened and closed repeatedly, sending shafts of light into the darkened room. "Boy, writers sure go to the bathroom a lot," muttered Gene Roddenberry. When the Desilu end credit flashed off the screen and the lights came up, half the audience was gone. "You're right, Gene," I responded, "but the bathrooms are at their homes and offices." Gene soon realized that most of the writers who liked the show could not write it unless they were primed. Facing the problem head-on, he wrote a number of basic story premises or springboards, which he furnished to the people with whom he wanted to work. Though leading to later recriminations and Writers Guild arbitrations as to who first had the idea and who did what to who, Gene's springboards put a number of writers to work. All the rules about Star Trek's future world existed mainly in Gene's mind. Unless he solved the familiarization problem, the number of acceptable scripts could have comfortably fit in a politician's heart. Thus was born the Star Trek Writer's Guide. It was derived from Gene's original series proposal, written while he was still at MGM and dated March 11, 1964, which was later rewritten by Gene and again by Dorothy Fontana. In addition to containing complete descriptions of every important character in the show, the guide delineated everything a writer or director needed to know about this future universe, how far mankind had progressed both scientifically and sociologically, how the United Federation of Planets was organized, and how Starfleet, its combination space exploration and military arm, functioned. Most science fiction writers failed in their efforts to understand this plot and budget-constrained medium, but some, Robert Bloch, Ted Sturgeon, Richard Matheson, Jerry Saul, Jerome Bixby, Norman Spinrad, George Clayton Johnson, and science fiction's incredibly angry young man, Harlan Ellison, wrote episodes for the show. But to his dismay, Gene Roddenberry soon discovered that some of the science fiction writers were both marvelous storytellers and lousy dramatists. Most of the science fiction writer scripts had to be heavily rewritten, and Gene had to do it. From the outset, believability was as major a concern as affordability. It didn't take Bob Justman long to realize that Captain Kirk and company could easily beam down to an unknown planet, breathe its noxious air, and die.
I strongly recommended that the Enterprise voyage only to planets with Earth-like environments where chances were best that life forms similar to humans could have evolved. This idea mirrored the Class M concept that Gene had previously described but hadn't fully covered in his March 11, 1964 sales proposal. Supposedly quoting orders to Captain Robert M. April, he wrote, "You will confine your landings and contacts to planets approximating Earth-Mars conditions, life, and social orders." In an April 12, 1966 memo expanding upon Gene Roddenberry's original concept, I wrote, "The USS Enterprise has as its primary function the investigation of other worlds and other civilizations which are likely to be similar to our own. Our Earth scientists at the time of our stories have plotted out certain areas within the galaxies which they say are likely to have a chance of supporting life as we know it. Therefore, rather than having the Enterprise and its crew happen upon civilizations which we can relate to purely as a matter of chance, we have a situation where that is their primary function. I think that this idea will give our format a definite direction which will be extremely useful to us in arriving at new stories." During the early phases of script development in 1966, I also wrote to Gene a memo on April 12th in which I laid out an unusual time travel story idea. "Dear Gene, the Enterprise is returning to Earth where refitting, rotation of crew, taking on of supplies, etc. is planned. On approaching Earth, there is a malfunction of the ship's machinery with regard to its time warp capabilities. The Enterprise, due to this malfunction, arrives back at a familiar planet which, of course, does turn out to be Earth. But this is the Earth of 1966, and not of their time. The Enterprise is sighted and identified as a UFO, and Kirk begins to see that by breaking through time, he is starting off a whole new and different sequence of events which will affect the future history of our planet. Who knows where this will lead? Perhaps it will turn out that he and Spock never really existed, that the whole future course of events will be changed so radically as to cause irreparable damage. Thereupon, the problem arises as how to go back and change what they have already set in motion. Finally, after much experimentation, they do in fact go back to the moment when they arrived back at Earth in 1966. UFO reports go out again, but the Enterprise disappears before any contact can be made. There remains on Earth the usual mass of spring UFO sighting reports, which are checked out and found to be wanting."
Gene gave no indication that he ever read Bob's story idea, so 8 months later, on December 12, 1966, in a memo entitled "What's Fair is Fair," Bob again wrote to Gene. Bob's reminder produced results because the show was still suffering a dearth of intriguing and affordable scripts. Gene assigned Bob's idea to Dorothy Fontana, who had just gone on staff as story editor. She wrote an excellent teleplay, Tomorrow is Yesterday, which posed some fascinating ideas about time travel and its effect upon both the history of the past and the history of the future. Unfortunately, Gene had a blind spot about recognizing the contribution of original material from others. On several occasions, I talked with Gene about his attitude that the public must perceive him as the originator of everything that was Star Trek, even given the fact that most of the original Star Trek doctrines, ideas, and concepts were not original to Star Trek at all, but rather were derived from current science and magazines, books, and films that predated his wagon train to the stars. Unfortunately, Gene brushed aside any such discussions. He apparently never saw this flaw. Sometimes Gene would joke about his colleagues' contributions by insisting that, for example, Gene Kuhn's creation of the Klingons and the Klingon culture, Bob Justman's many story ideas and production concepts, and my contribution of the Captain's Log Stardate concept all came from his cousin in Ohio. It was the beginning of what years later could be referred to as the Star Trek myth, a legend of ideas and accomplishments that became the lightning rod for the millions of fans whose fervor and support thrust Star Trek into the rarefied atmosphere of near-galactic success. So, accordingly, Gene gave Bob neither credit nor payment for the story. In fact, he never even thanked him.
No Star Trek writer's work was immune from Gene's rewrite process, regardless of experience, talent, or position. John D.F. Black was our first associate producer story consultant. With John busy writing The Naked Time, his first original script for the series, his story consultant responsibilities suffered accordingly, and his rewriting output became less than prodigious. Soon producer Roddenberry realized it was up to writer Roddenberry to rework most of the early scripts. John had put in a great deal of time and hard work in writing his first draft, and he was proud of every single word he had written. A week after submitting his script to Gene, John rushed into my office, frantically waving a mimeographed copy of Gene's rewrite of The Naked Time. "He can't do this to me," trumpeted the aggrieved writer, breathing hard, his nostrils flaring with rage. Gene had read the script, rewrote it without telling John, and sent it out to be mimeographed. Now John knew how it felt to be rewritten by the great bird of the galaxy. John had anticipated praise from his boss. Instead, he got his ego trampled. "He can take the damn script and shove it," he yelled. It took me an hour to talk him out of quitting. But after Gene's heavy-handed dealing with John Black's script, the party was over and it was time to call it a day. John never again had the same positive disposition toward Star Trek. On the day his contract expired, he opened a bottle of champagne in his office and, toasting the occasion, celebrated the fact that he no longer worked for Gene Roddenberry. But there were two first-year Star Trek writers whose efforts were appreciated, even years later. Cary Wilbur and Gene Kuhn, using his pen name Lee Cronin, wrote the episode Space Seed and created the character of Khan Noonien Singh, a role that was played by Ricardo Montalban. Little did Wilbur and Kuhn realize that their efforts would be used later as the basis for the second Star Trek motion picture, Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan, with Ricardo Montalban recreating his original role.
Back in April 1966, almost 2 months prior to the start of production, one of the lead stories in the Hollywood casting news was headlined, "Star Trek Recasts Again." With Star Trek now a network series, the third time had better be right. Gene Roddenberry made no bones, pun intended, about wanting DeForest Kelley to play the new Doctor of the Enterprise. All agreed. D. Kelley would bring a much-needed humanity to the role of Dr. McCoy. However, there remained some question as to his wearability over 26 episodes. No one at Desilu or NBC had any idea how important Dr. McCoy would become in the Star Trek saga to follow. there was almost another new face aboard the Enterprise. If it had not been for his very aggressive agent, Jimmy Doohan, one of Star Trek's most beloved actors, would not have made the cut. Shortly after NBC ordered the series, Doohan received a letter from Gene Roddenberry informing him, "We don't think we need an engineer in the series." Doohan was confused by Gene's direct communication and informed his agent, Paul Wilkins, that apparently he'd been fired. Wilkins became irate and met with Gene, and by the close of business that day, Doohan was returned to the Enterprise engine room. Millions of fans should be thankful to Paul Wilkins for getting Doohan back on board. NBC was unaware of Gene's attempt to fire Doohan. NBC Programs head Mort Werner had sent out a directive to the producers of all the network series concerning NBC's policy to hire more actors from diverse racial backgrounds. Gene surprisingly decided to drop Lloyd Haynes, the only African-American actor in the second pilot. In May 1965, after the series' first stories were being fleshed out into shooting scripts, there was no mention of a new character, a sexy female communications officer. Soon, however, Gene talked of inserting this new role into several scripts. He wanted to call her Lieutenant Sulu, intending to rename George Takei's character. Even before the first shooting scripts were completed, Gene had asked our casting director, Joe DiAgusta, to prepare a list of actress suggestions for this new role. Then one day, a casting idea suddenly engulfed Gene. "Herb," he said, "I just remember this actress who worked for me on The Lieutenant. I'm going to bring her. You'll like her." The following day, Gene escorted Nichelle Nichols to my office for introductions. She was pretty, sexy, vital, and African-American, and would fulfill our desire to have a racially mixed cast. She was, as I later discovered, not just a sudden afterthought. But I had reservations about the new character's name. Sulu sounded too much like Zulu, and the plan for racial diversity in the show might have been misread and misunderstood. So Gene agreed and retained George Takei's original character name, but what to name the new communications officer? When Nichelle Nichols first came in for her interview, she was carrying a book about Africa entitled Uhuru. Bob Justman explained to Gene that the word Uhuru meant freedom in Swahili. Gene took the word, changed it to Uhura, and gave it to his Discovery. The new character had a new name. It was almost as if Gene had planned everything.
Now that Gene once again had Nichelle, he inserted the new character into an already network-approved script. In the Corbomite maneuver, Communications Officer Dave Bailey suddenly became Navigator Dave Bailey, and some of his original dialogue was given to Nichelle, our new Communications Officer, Lieutenant Uhura.
Grace Lee Whitney was another refugee from Gene's unsold police story pilot. She had played the part of Police Lieutenant Lily Monroe and, as in the case of DeForest Kelley, Grace Lee was available. Gene liked Grace Lee. Unlike the two prior model-type and cute yeoman actresses, she appeared to him as what she was, pretty, sexy, and vulnerable. Yeoman Janice Rand was piped aboard the USS Enterprise. She was dressed in her William Ware Tice design outfit, a short skirt that emphasized her legs and a tunic that emphasized her bosom. Grace Lee and Gene both welcomed the attention she received.
Although he was our costume designer, Bill Tice was assigned by Gene the task of designing Grace Lee's hairstyles. He'd bring in a sketch, and soon, with considerable input from Gene, the design would be finalized. Almost. Then Virginia Darcy, our hairstylist, would go to work and build it on the actress. Every time Grace Lee was brought back for inspection, Gene spent an inordinate amount of time fussing with the bouffant hair creation. Gene explained that it was necessary to invent unusual hairstyles so viewers would feel they were really witnessing the future. Well, he fussed and poked and pushed and prodded until Grace Lee finally ended up with an enormous beehive hairdo. It must have been damned uncomfortable to cart around, but she never complained. It looked so heavy and was so thickly lacquered, I joked, You could hit it with a sledgehammer and never make a dent.
No discussion of the new faces who came aboard the Enterprise for the series would be complete without the mention of Majel Barrett, the defrocked #1 from the first pilot. Noticing her NBC-requested absence from the second pilot, I waited for Gene to plot and execute a sneak Majel into the series move. Majel wasn't coy about insisting Gene make her a regular in the series. "I'm suffering from pillow talk, Herb," he confided in me. Severe pillow talk. So Gene began the campaign. First he told Majel, and then subsequently hinted to several journalists off the record, that NBC rejected Majel for the second pilot because the network executives were sexist, not wanting a series star to be a strong woman. His move embarrassed NBC, and later he denied ever making the statement. He conveniently forgot that the NBC execs, for both financial and moral reasons, had always favored a strong woman as a series star. They just didn't want Majel, and they resented having her forced upon them for the first pilot. Several more moves were still needed to make Majel a fixture in the Star Trek series. But for this first 1966 season, 3 new faces, Kelly, Nichols, and Whitney, boarded the USS Enterprise to join Shatner, Nimoy, Doohan, and Takei.
The real magic time was here. We had to shoot at least 16 consecutive one-hour episodes, and the adventure into the unknown was to begin. On Tuesday, May 24, 1966, at 8:22 a.m., the cameras rolled on the first shot of the Corbomite Maneuver, the first episode produced of the father of them all, the original Star Trek series. Serendipity came to the fore on that first day of filming. Spock's speech patterns had been formalized during the second pilot. Herb Solow had recommended that because English was a second language to Spock, he should speak it precisely, perfectly, and in measured cadence. But his attitudes hadn't yet been formalized. During an extremely tense scene, Kirk and company had to face what appeared to be an incredibly powerful and frightening adversary who appeared on the ship's main viewing screen. Everyone was transfixed and fearful, even the intrepid Captain Kirk. But not Mr. Spock. Director Joseph Sargent gave Leonard the key to his character by suggesting that, contrary to what was called for in the script, Spock remain aloof and deliver his one-word reaction introspectively, expressing curiosity rather than fear. Fascinating. The Spockian attitude was defined for the future. The Corbomite Maneuver contained one of Roddenberry's novel ideas. He cast a little boy to portray a bald, all-powerful adversary who used an awesome-looking dummy monster to frighten away interplanetary interlopers. Later, Gene had the boy's dialogue replaced by the deep voice of a mature actor. Gene's idea was good, but getting the bewildered child to act and enunciate at the same time gave director Joe Sargent fits. The child, actor-director Ron Howard's brother, Clint, could hardly pronounce the complicated dialogue, but he sure did look weird in his Fred Phillips-created polished head. Sargent had to resort to making pickup shots, filming one line at a time until the all-powerful adversary got it somewhat right. The Corbomite Maneuver was the 10th episode broadcast and was first seen on November 10, 1966.
In August, before the series debuted, a screening for NBC was held at Desilu, at which time the premiere episode was to be selected from the small group of episodes that could be ready in time for the first air date, Thursday night, September 8, 1966, at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. NBC's and Desilu's desire was to deliver what the opening main title promised, Strange New Worlds. There were really only 2 serious candidates, Mantrap and The Naked Time. The second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, was held back because it was too expository in terms of the series' concept and characters, a problem with most pilots telecast as series episodes. Where No Man Has Gone Before was necessary for selling, not necessarily for televising. Mud's Women was out of the running because the opening night critics would have had a field day with the story of space hookers in the galaxy. Charlie X was too gentle a tale, dealing with the problems of a troubled teenager. The Enemy Within was another shipboard show that lacked the scope of Star Trek's premise. Despite a fine performance by William Shatner, it was held back for later telecast.
I felt that the Naked Time episode made it easy for viewers to understand the main characters of our show and their relationships to each other. But the story took place mainly aboard ship. NBC made the decision. Roddenberry and Solo agreed with them. The first show broadcast would be Man Trap, the 4th episode filmed. It not only took place on a distant planet, but also featured a character, Nancy Crater, who had been taken over by a loathsome, salt-sucking creature. Although Gene Roddenberry was brilliant in creating unusual concepts and story ideas, he practiced every imaginable technique to avoid one of his primary responsibilities, writing Captain Kirk's opening narration. Star Trek's famous main title narration came about under the pressure of an approaching crucial deadline. On August 1st, 1966, with the season premiere set for September 8th, only weeks away, I prodded Gene to write the show's opening narration. But as usual, he continued to procrastinate. With only a few days left to ship the premiere episode to NBC for broadcast, it was now or never. The episode was complete except for this necessary and long-promised element. Finally goaded into action, Gene took a stab at writing it, incorporating Sam Peoples' pilot title, Where No Man Has Gone Before. He sent his first version to John Black and me. Gene asked for our comments and contributions. After an exchange of memos, he incorporated some of the suggestions into what became Captain Kirk's famous opening narration. On the afternoon of August 10, 1966, literally minutes after Gene finished writing his final version, I phoned Bill Shatner on stage where he was working on Dagger of the Mind, our 9th episode to be filmed. I told him to drop everything, and then I ran across the street to the dubbing stage. Bill raced to meet me and arrived a minute later, slightly out of breath. We rehearsed the dialogue several times and made a take. Due to Bill's classical training, his delivery was excellent, but the narration sounded too contemporary. There was something lacking. It didn't seem to ring out. I asked the sound mixer to add reverberation to Shatner's voice. We made another take, and the results were perfect. Bill had become Captain Kirk, the adventurous commander of a spacecraft of the future when he declared, "Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise, its 5-year mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before." Innovative storytelling wasn't enough to firmly establish in the viewers' minds a society several hundred years in the future. The interiors of the Enterprise would have to convince them they were actually aboard an ultramodern spaceship. There were certain limitations to the design and construction of sets. Feasibility and practicality dictated what could and could not be done. Visitors to the set, not to mention eagle-eyed viewers, were always amused that no matter how rocky and bumpy the walls of underground or cave sets on foreign planets might be, the floors were always flat and smooth. The practicality was that cameras couldn't dolly over bumpy floors, and when stuntmen staged fights, they had to be careful not to hit the rocky cave walls and crash right through. As a matter of fact, those wishing to leave the underground world in the Devil in the Dark episode could have easily punched their way out.
Necessity made Matt Jeffries the absolute mother of Star Trek invention. As engineering officer Scott gained importance, there came the need for a compact set where Scotty could feverishly work to effect emergency repairs on the ship's internal circuitry when the preservation of a peaceful galaxy and the future of the Enterprise was in doubt. With short notice and little money, Matt designed a tall cylinder which later became known as the Jeffries tube. The camera could shoot straight down at engineer Scott as he clung to the inside of the cramped set, with lights flickering all around him. An assortment of bells and whistles, gongs and beeps were laid in afterward by the sound editors.
Whenever shooting scripts called for the Jeffries tube, Matt added more doojiggers and thingamajigs to it. Since there was no space available on Stage 8 to keep the contraption set up all the time, Jeffries put his tube on wheels so it could be easily moved in whenever it became necessary for Scotty to restore warp power and save the galaxy. Again. Flexibility of sets was of prime importance, what with limited stage space and new sets needed for every episode. As a result of a memo from Gene urging greater creativity in the use and reuse of sets, Jeffries designed the Enterprise's briefing room so that it could be redressed and used as a recreation room or a cargo space. Similarly, Scotty's engineering space became a shuttlecraft bay when needed. And other sets were designed for quick conversion. Kirk's cabin became Spock's cabin, became an alien passenger's cabin, became Kirk's cabin all over again. Pull out a wall and stick in a different one, pull out the wall on one end and stick it back in on the other end, and, with a change of furniture and fabrics, voila, another set.
Star Trek's music gave viewers a human point of reference for the unusual characters and the events in the stories. Alexander Courage's hauntingly melodic main title theme had served both pilots well. It would now serve the series. The charismatic four-note ping, 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 ping was a mysterious but welcoming beacon to viewers every week, and every time an episode would run and be rerun, Alexander Courage would receive 100% of the BMI music royalties, or so he thought. Gene Roddenberry, who had never written a music lyric, decided to write one for the Star Trek theme, a lyric that would rarely be sung or used in any manner other than being printed on the published orchestral and band arrangements. Its purpose was not an expression of creativity, it was purely financial. Gene Roddenberry, the lyricist, would now receive 50% of all music royalties, and Alexander Courage, the composer, would receive the remaining 50%. When Sandy Courage was given his contract to write the Star Trek music, he was unaware of a two-sentence clause toward the end of the agreement that gave Gene the right to write a lyric to Courage's theme. When Sandy questioned Gene Roddenberry, Gene explained, "Hey, I have to get some money somewhere. I'm sure not going to get it out of the profits of Star Trek." Here are a few lines from those lyrics. "Beyond the rim of the starlight, my love is wandering in starflight. I know he'll find in star-clustered reaches love strange, love a star woman teaches." As Sandy Courage pointed out, Roddenberry's lyrics totally lacked musical practicality. With Gene taking half of Sandy's sole credit and royalty, I again marveled at his seemingly unending drive to fashion himself as the single master, the absolute proprietor of Star Trek, and this allegiance to the master by followers of Star Trek would ensure the future success of anything relating to Star Trek.
It's no wonder Sandy Courage lost all enthusiasm for the series and for his friendship with Gene Roddenberry. He scored only 2 of the first season's episodes and thereafter never returned to Star Trek. With Sandy Courage unavailable, it was necessary to find composers whose talents would suit our individual and very distinctive episodes. Fred Steiner became the brightest star in our symphonic universe. His music seemed to spring full-blown from deep within him to support and reinforce the on-screen drama. It's no wonder that I hired Fred to write and conduct more scores by far than any other Star Trek composer. Totally reliable and immensely talented, he wrote symphonic themes so generic that they were often reused later in the season when, for budgetary reasons, we had to track certain shows with previously recorded Star Trek music composed by him. Music could be composed, but the sounds of the future had to be invented. Sound effects editors Joe Sorokin and Doug Grindstaff became the inventors of new noises for the multitude of devices seen in the series. Some are familiar, even famous. The shimmering transporter effect that follows Captain Kirk's now famous command to his chief engineer, "Beam me up, Scotty," the twittering noises emitted whenever he unlimbered his communicator, and the phaser pistol's characteristic warble whenever it was set on stun and fired at an enemy. Defying the dictates of science, the phaser warble sound reached a crescendo when the Enterprise fired a broadside. Science has proved there can be no sound in the vacuum of space, but without sound effects, much of the drama and excitement of the visuals would be lost. So, when the ship fired its weapons, the soundtrack was filled with noise, and the resultant explosions were horrific. When the ship warped past camera, the noise of its passage was magnificent. Not only that, when the Enterprise changed course, it banked like an airplane. Without exciting visuals and exciting noises to back them up, much of the drama of the show's space miniatures would be lost. Dramatic license was the reason, not the excuse, why Gene and his team purposefully ignored the dictates of science. Gene was intense about using sound creatively. His interest in the effect that sound had on viewers led him to give me a special assignment. Bob, I want you to come up with a different sound for each part of the ship. Sound effects editor Doug Grindstaff moaned and groaned when I told him. Every set, Bob? Every set? No, not every set, just the ones we see. Doug groaned again. Not funny, Bob. Unfunny, Bob. It took hours and hours of work by Doug and his crew. We then moved to the dubbing stage, mixing and blending the various tracks into an individual track for each section of the Enterprise. They were composed of not only machine noise and the pinging of the ship's sensors, but a number of voice tracks of crew members which supposedly emanated from communications channels. After we finished all the generic Enterprise tracks, whenever a scene took place on the bridge or sickbay or the corridors, a particular sound loop was utilized to paint an audio picture of that set. The sounds weren't obtrusive, but they were always there, in the background, and they helped give a feeling of reality to what was happening. Of course, there were times when specific shows required specific dialogue, which we called wild tracks. For Star Trek's first season Charlie X episode, Gene Roddenberry volunteered to record a message from a cook in the Enterprise galley when the ship's routine was turned topsy-turvy by Charlie, a disgruntled teenager with unusual powers. Gene's voice can be heard on the bridge intercom complaining, "I put meatloaf in the oven, and now there's turkeys, real live turkeys."
By August 1966, with the first air date still weeks away, Gene Roddenberry, whose long suit had never been stamina, was running out of gas. The series desperately needed fresh and inventive story ideas. It needed a writing machine. Gene Roddenberry asked his agent and his writer friends for help. It came in the person of writer-producer Gene L. Kuhn. World War II veteran, Korean War combat radio correspondent, novelist, and screenwriter, Kuhn had been cranking out quality scripts in machine-like fashion for a successful CBS series, The Wild Wild West, without ever missing a deadline. He'd been a fertile source of ideas for that show's other writers as well. Soon, Gene Kuhn, fresh and strong and oblivious to pressure, became Star Trek's savior and Bob Justman's new hero.
Although his title was producer, Gene Kuhn knew he was hired to write, and write he did. He was an ever-fertile source of story ideas, and, as I called him, the fastest typewriter in the West. He churned out page after page of shootable and exciting scripts while chain-smoking his way through pack after pack of Sherman cigarillos. And exciting scripts weren't his only contribution to Star Trek. In one of his rare acknowledgments of others who contributed to the series, Gene Roddenberry wrote in a February 19, 1968 letter to columnist John Stanley, "Gene Kuhn did bring many new ideas and concepts to the show. Not the least was the arch-villains, the Klingons, and their subculture." Gene Kuhn's appearance was deceiving. At first, to me, he looked like the stereotypical B-picture banker who delighted in foreclosing on impoverished old ladies. But from his writing and his persona, I soon realized Gene Kuhn was a romantic. He was a romantic with an obvious sense of humor. But, oddly enough, Arena, his first script for Star Trek almost never happened.
Plain and simply, we were running out of scripts. Several writers hadn't delivered as promised, and suddenly there were only two choices of action available to us: either shut down the shooting company or somehow find another script. Gene Roddenberry was away, and Gene Coon was busy rewriting other writers' scripts, but none of those would be ready in time, so Coon decided to take some direct action. He asked Bob if he could leave the studio a little earlier that Friday afternoon to go home, lock himself in a room, and not emerge until Monday morning with a new script. R.J. was thrilled and said, "If you can do that, go home early every weekend." Coon returned mid-morning Monday with a new script in hand. Now I was thrilled. The script was quickly put into Mimeo, and copies were rushed to NBC for their approval and to Kellum DeForest's office for factual research and legal approvals. But suddenly, the thrill was gone. Coon, an ardent reader of science fiction since he was a child, in his haste to create a story, had inadvertently based part of his script on a short story that had been written by Frederick Brown. Kellum's assistant, Joan Pierce, who reviewed, analyzed, and wrote the research reports on all Star Trek scripts, recognized the story. She remembers that when she advised Coon of the problem, his reaction was a horrified, "Oh my God." Joan has absolutely no doubt that he was unaware he had lifted the material. But Coon had transgressed, and there was no way we could shoot the script without buying a plagiarism lawsuit. Gene Coon and I met with others at Desilu and formulated a plan. Business Affairs would call Brown, tell him Star Trek would like to buy his story, and offer him a fair price. And they did. Brown was thrilled to have one of his stories on Star Trek and accepted the deal. We never did tell him that the script had already been written and was scheduled for production. Arena was a difficult action show and was filmed mostly on location. Joseph Pevney, an ex-actor turned director who was brought to Star Trek by Gene Coon, was possessed of both unfailing optimism and good nature and worked exceptionally well with the cast. He brought the episode in on time. He was signed for multiple shows and ended up directing 5 episodes that season. 2 of those episodes became famous: The Devil in the Dark, written by Gene Coon, and The City on the Edge of Forever, written by Harlan Ellison. Gene Roddenberry claimed to be progressive when it came to sexual politics, but his actual practices belied it. He wanted the actresses in the show to be visual sex objects. Even uniformed female crew members were not exempt. They were chosen on the basis of their looks, and their costumes were designed to emphasize feminine physical qualities: short skirts and high-heeled boots to show off their legs, nipped-in waist and well-filled tunics to emphasize their female figures.
No matter what he was doing, Gene always dropped everything when Tice came to the office to display actresses in their costumes for his approval. Gene took great pleasure in making hands-on adjustments, but sometimes the adjustments went a bit too far. Case in point, Sherry Jackson, former child star on the Danny Thomas Show, had grown up to become an exquisitely beautiful young woman. Bill Tice brought her to the projection room where we were viewing dailies. She was scheduled to begin work shortly after lunch in the episode What Are Little Girls Made Of?, and her costume had to be approved. Gene stopped the projector. Sherry was petite, but her body was perfect. The tunic that Tice designed for her was open on both sides, and there was no way she could wear a bra without it being seen, as if she had any need for one. The top of her costume concealed very little. Gene felt the garment could be improved by making some hands-on adjustments. "Maybe if we tack the sides back a little more," I suggested, and moved forward. "I'll do it," growled Gene, shouldering me aside. He certainly didn't need any help from me at that particular time. Bill Shatner was in the projection room with us and tried to get into the act. "I think Bob's right. Maybe if you—" he volunteered and moved to help. But Gene shouldered him aside, too. In reality, there wasn't much more that could be done to the costume without provoking an uproar from the NBC censors. So, after he removed another square inch or two of fabric, Jean reluctantly approved her garment. I was a very good listener. Jean knew that and several times complained to me about the pressures of his female relationships, which strained even his monumental patience. I had just walked into his office as he slammed the telephone receiver down. He was really upset. Surprised, I asked, "What's wrong, Bird?" "Women. Eileen's unhappy," Eileen was his wife, "and she's giving me problems. And not only that, Majel's still after me to write in a role for her as a regular, and I don't know how to do it." Jean had tried to keep Majel happy by giving her a job as the computer voice aboard the Enterprise. She worked hard to perfect a mechanically dispassionate voice that still had a recognizable personality. She was successful at it and, in fact, continued to provide that disembodied voice in all the later Star Trek series. But, first and foremost, she was an actress. She wanted to be on camera and act. She wanted to be a real member of the Enterprise crew.
Jean finally found a solution to the problem. He created Nurse Christine Chapel. As executive producer, Jean would see to it that this necessary character, Nurse Chapel, would definitely recur. And since NBC hadn't liked the dark-haired Majel in the first pilot, the series Majel would be a blonde, as if no one at NBC would notice. But believe me, they did. Jerry Stanley announced to me, well, look who's back.
After seeing the first dailies in which Majel appeared, I cornered Jean in his office. "Jean, I didn't like the scene with Majel." Jean just smiled, as he always did, when I told him something he didn't particularly want to hear. "I thought she was fine," he responded. "I like her a lot in this role." Pushing him further just wouldn't work. I finally stopped needling him after finally becoming aware of their relationship. Years later, I realized it wasn't the actress I disliked, it was the role. Nurse Chapel was a wimpy, badly written, and ill-conceived character. In The Naked Time, all she did was stand around and pine for Mr. Spock, much the same as Yeoman Rand did for Captain Kirk. And in Little Girls, Nurse Chapel pined for her fiancé, mad scientist Dr. Corby. The close-up shots of her eyes misting over and lower lip quivering were beautifully photographed by cameraman Jerry Finneman, who used special lighting and diffusion lenses. But this only served to emphasize the lack of character written into the character. Majel was always just dropping in. Even when we first started production, she hung around the offices, making herself useful even though she wasn't yet acting in the series. If there was an office birthday party, and there were always office birthday parties, she'd be one of the organizers and the hostess to Jean's host. I was the last one to realize that Jean and Majel had something going. We were working late, as usual, when Jean issued a blanket invitation. "Come on over to Majel's new place for some drinks, guys." "New place? Where's that, Jean?" Just around the corner. Leave your car. You can, walk there faster." So we went, and for the first time I realized Jean not only was leading a double life, he was probably paying the rent on the apartment, his home away from home. The following morning I took Jean aside and cautioned him. "Jean, you're skating on thin ice. You can't be that out in the open about Majel. People will find out that you're keeping her, and so will Eileen." I felt that his behavior was destructive to his wife. Eileen didn't deserve that kind of treatment. Jean smiled. He wasn't at all perturbed. He seemed proud and, in fact, delighted in flaunting his arrangement.
The discussion of Gene Roddenberry's sexual attitudes and adventures may seem out of place when analyzing the development of Star Trek, but it's actually a very important component of Gene's vision of the future. Everyone had a role in Gene's future world, and for Gene, a woman's role was primarily as a decorative tool in a man's workshop. On the Labor Day weekend, just prior to the first air date, Gene Roddenberry flew to Cleveland, Ohio. He was intent on personally introducing Star Trek to the country's leading science fiction writers and fans who had gathered at the annual World Science Fiction Convention called TriCon that year. he carried a print of Where No Man Has Gone Before and 3 Star Trek crew uniforms, 1 female and 1 male, plus Sherry Jackson's skimpy costume from Little Girls. Gene had made prior arrangements for a young woman to display Bill Tice's creation, and in a rare extroverted display, very unlike Gene, he hoped to fit himself into the other uniform. Science fiction writer Jerry Soule remembered the uniform in a letter to Gene. I had to laugh. I remembered Gene Roddenberry, who went all the way to Cleveland to prove his point at the World Science Fiction Convention that Star Trek was the greatest science fiction show ever to hit TV, and I remembered a Gene Roddenberry who sweated bullets getting into his costume and wearing it at the ball. The Sherry Jackson costume evoked a different comment. It was worn by a very attractive and well-endowed young model whose talents immediately caught the attention of famed science fiction writer and bachelor Harlan Ellison. To quote a bystander, "We got a big kick out of watching Harlan. He was on her like a pack of fleas on a hound dog." But Harlan struck out. The girl knew how to handle the pitch, even when it came from such a creative pitchman. Gene Roddenberry's experience in Cleveland, rubbing elbows with the most prominent members of the science fiction writers of America, provided him with an idea he would exploit months later when he enlisted their aid to help save Star Trek from cancellation. That weekend, Gene's efforts paid off. Where No Man Has Gone Before, unlike the other television and theatrical film screen, was well received. The science fiction aficionados at the convention were entranced by the new show, but in 4 days, the series would premiere on television to a national audience, which thought science fiction was comic books of busty women being dragged away by alligator people, or a giant purple blob intent on dissolving Tokyo. Earlier in the summer, NBC had devised a strategy to give its new series a head start on their ABC and CBS competition. They called it Sneak Preview Week. It was very simple. Rather than introduce the series during the week that historically always began the fall television season, NBC, and ABC, as it later turned out, scheduled their premieres during the prior week. A newspaper advertising blitz in the major television markets accompanied the switch and directed viewers, hungry for new programs after the long, hot summer of repeats, to sample the exciting new NBC color lineup. The Star Trek newspaper ads, run on September 8, 1966, displayed an artist's sketch of Bill Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. The sketch avoided showing Nimoy's pointed ears. There were several unrecognizable characters in the background, and the Enterprise circling a planet, spelling out in its wake, Star Trek, 8:30 p.m. in color. Welcome aboard the United States Spaceship Enterprise. Where it goes, no program has ever gone before. According to Nielsen Media Research, the Star Trek premiere attracted only 11,360,000 viewers. Its average rating for the 1-hour time period was a low 20.7. Nevertheless, Lucille Ball sent a well-meaning note. Dear Gene and the rest of you hard-working people, just heard the good news and want you to know how proud and happy I am. Looks like you really have a hit on your hands, and we all appreciate your efforts. Love, Lucy. Her note was a lot more optimistic than the critical response would indicate. The 2 most important reviews for Star Trek and NBC were in different editions of the entertainment industry trade paper, Variety. The review in Weekly Variety, published in New York City and considered the Bible of the motion picture distribution and advertising agency business, began, Star Trek obviously solicits all-out suspension of disbelief, but it won't work. The review concluded, the biggest guessing game is figuring out how this lowercase Fantasia broke into the sked. Legendary columnist Jack Hellman of the Daily Variety, published in Hollywood and catering primarily to the creative side of the business, reviewed Mantrap. And away we go to another planet for the science fiction buffs to lick the dish clean. But there better be a hefty cargo of them, or the Nielsen samplers may come up short. It's not for the common herd who prefer less cerebral exercises. The review also said, not conducive to its popularity is the lack of meaningful cast leads. They move around with a directorial precision, with only violence to provide the excitement, and very little of that over the hour spread. And it continued, the whistling sounds of the planetary devices added only to the confusion of the fleeting figures up and down the corridors. It's understandable that all members of the Hollywood creative community enjoy being on a winning team. Daily Variety had just advised Star Trek writers, directors, actors, composers, and others involved not to quit their day jobs.
That first season, the writing of Ellison's award-winning teleplay, City on the Edge of Forever, was an adventure almost as intriguing as the script itself. Harlan was behind schedule right from the start, taking 2 months to write his final revised story outline. Although his story outline contained inherent production problems, I loved it. Fearful that the millennium would arrive before Harlan's next effort, Gene Roddenberry prevailed upon him to write his first draft teleplay at the studio. Harlan arrived with his own typewriter, his own portable radio, and his own original approach to creativity. Every now and then, visitors to our office building were surprised at the sight of Harlan cartwheeling down the long, narrow corridor, unwinding while he took a break from the typewriter. The cubbyhole office we had assigned to Harlan was too confining. It was also the show's wardrobe storage room, so Harlan had to endure lots of interruptions. Luckily, he liked to work at night. And there were times when Harlan, seeking to get a breath of air, would escape. After a while, however, Harlan complained we were forcing him, quote, to work under inhuman and inhumane conditions, unquote. Since we desperately needed his final draft teleplay, I arranged for Harlan to work and sleep inside my office until he finished the script. It was really a jail sentence. I said, I'm locking you in every night, Harlan, so the sooner you finish, the sooner you can go free. Surprisingly, Harlan had finished his first draft teleplay in 3 weeks. He departed for even greener pastures while we attempted to deal with what he had wrought, and it was a doozy. And it occasioned me to write another memo to John D. F. Black saying, without a doubt, this is the best and most beautifully written screenplay we have gotten to date and possibly will ever get this season. If you tell this to Harlan, I'll kill you. Despite our hopes, it was evident to Gene and me that the first draft of City was far from being shootable. There were more than budgetary problems with this first Ellison script. We were concerned that some of the guest starship officers, as written by him for this episode, didn't behave in the upright manner expected from proper Starfleet personnel. We made Harlan aware that if the script was to be made, it would have to undergo revisions. It took almost 4 months for him to deliver his final draft. Although part of the delay can be attributed to his involvement in the Science Fiction Writers of America campaign to save Star Trek, and part can be attributed to scripts he was writing for other television shows, it would seem that his late delivery could be attributed to the fact that he was psychologically opposed to rewriting what he had originally wrought. Gene Coon was the next one to work on the script. Harlan had already made one very important change in the original storyline. 2 drug-crazed and deranged characters, Lebec and Beckwith, had been the ones who precipitated the problems for Kirk and Company. I suggested that not only could we save money by losing both characters, it would also give DeForest Kelley a larger and much more important role to play in the story. So in Harlan's latest script, both characters were replaced by Dr. McCoy, and it was Bones McCoy, maddened by an accidental drug overdose, who motivated the action. Most of Gene Coon's rewrite was accomplished over the Christmas and New Year's holidays, and it was delivered on January 9, 1967. On January 10, I wrote to Coon. This is pretty close to a shooting script, finally. There are certain areas within it, however, which I feel need some work before we can say that we can come anywhere close to budget on the show. It was time for another set of hands. Dorothy Fontana had recently become the show's new story editor, and the next version of Ellison's story was to be her unwanted assignment. And, finally, Gene Roddenberry churned out his own revised final draft teleplay. His version is the one we began filming on the morning of February 3rd. And even as filming continued, revised pages kept showing up on the set. Harlan didn't take too kindly to being rewritten. In fact, he was outraged. On February 3, 1967, the day that City on the Edge of Forever began filming, I received a letter from his agent which said, Mr. Ellison would like his credit on Star Trek episode City on the Edge of Forever, production number 6149-28, to read Cordwainer Bird. I would appreciate it if this information were passed on to the appropriate people, inasmuch as I understand the show starts shooting this week. For Harlan to have removed his name from the episode would have been tantamount to announcing to the science fiction community that Star Trek was like all the other so-called science fiction shows. They promise a lot, they deliver little. Gene Roddenberry couldn't afford to let such a thing happen. After a lot of fussing and hemming and hawing, and finally, according to Harlan, an absolute threat from Gene to keep him from ever working in Hollywood again, Cordwainer Bird was convinced to revert to being Harlan Ellison again, and his screen credit reflected that fact. Nevertheless, the uneasy truce that ensued between Harlan and Gene was never again anything even remotely approaching comfortable.
Harlan's attitude towards script revisions is best explained by his actions at the 1967 Writers Guild of America Awards dinner. Among those writers nominated for the outstanding script in a television dramatic series was Ellison's script, City on the Edge of Forever. It was at L'Escoffier, the elegant restaurant at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, and sitting happily around the Desilu table were the two Genes, R.J., my friend and well-known screenwriter Howard Rodman, myself, and our wives. We were all excited. There was a chance that a Star Trek script would win the award. The announcement was made. The award for the most outstanding script for a dramatic television series is City on the Edge of Forever, story and teleplay by Harlan Ellison. We applauded our hero Harlan as he rose from his chair at another table and strode to the podium to receive his award and say a few words. Well, perhaps more than a few words. After all, the winner was Harlan. But after Harlan finished saying all the usual nice things about his writer peers and his guild, failing to mention Star Trek, he turned his attention to artistic integrity, and our joy evaporated. Harlan berated the studio executive Suits and the producers of television series for interfering with the creative process. But the ultimate insult was yet to come. Building to a passionate finale, Harlan suddenly brandished his original script high above his head, shook it in the manner of Napoleon Bonaparte preparing his armies for battle, and declared, "Remember, never let them rewrite you." The writer-dominated audience rose to their feet en masse and hailed this living hero who had the guts to publicly speak out against them. And as Harlan walked away from the podium, he looked over to our table and defiantly shook his script at us. I was relatively calm as I stared at the two knives lying before me on the table, the dinner knife and the butter knife. Which one should I use to kill Harlan, I wondered. I decided on the butter knife. It was sort of dull and would cause more pain. Gene Roddenberry seemed amused. He turned to us, shrugged, and smiled. So what else is new? Star Trek's ratings were both positive and negative signs of whether the series would be renewed for a second season. Although the numbers were low, they were steadily low, no dramatic fluctuations week after week. That was the positive, indicating an intensely loyal audience. These forerunners of Trekkers watched Star Trek because they liked the series. But the 1966 reality was that NBC research executives put major emphasis on raw audience figures rather than indicating a particular series' demographics, and Star Trek had failed to deliver. Late one night in November 1966, Gene Roddenberry looked up from the script he'd been rewriting, stared at the wall of his office, and saw the handwriting. If the hoped-for ratings increase failed to develop, 3 years of hard work might all have been for naught. Star Trek would end its life as merely a noble experiment in trying to bring an intelligent science fiction series to television. And with no new projects in development, not only would Star Trek be gone, Gene would be out of work. Harlan Ellison was still in the midst of his last City on the Edge of Forever rewrite when Gene Roddenberry proposed a Save Star Trek campaign utilizing the help of the Science Fiction Writers of America. Ellison liked the idea and volunteered to help organize the Committee, an advisory group of famous science fiction writers that included Powell Anderson, Isaac Asimov, Robert Bloch, Lester Del Rey, Harlan Ellison, Philip Jose Farmer, Frank Herbert, Richard Matheson, Theodore Sturgeon, and A.E. Van Vogt. Soon the renewal campaign began to bear fruit. Science fiction fans across the nation protested the perceived cancellation and wrote to complain. NBC realized belatedly that it had something of a bull by the tail. It was February 22, 1967, and we had just completed principal photography on Operation Annihilate, the initial season's last episode. Feelings of both enormous relief and enormous anxiety pervaded the studio. Gene Roddenberry, Gene Kuhn, Bob Justman, and I shook our heads in near disbelief. 26 new episodes had been filmed. Adding the Menagerie two-parter envelope and the second pilot made a grand total of 29 first-season episodes. We had truly climbed Mount Everest. But with our mountain high also came the anxiety and the almost hourly renewal vigil. Then, prior to the March 9, 1967 broadcast of Devil in the Dark, NBC had advised the studio that Star Trek would live another year to continue its exploration of distant galaxies and other new air dates. On March 9, 1967, an NBC announcer broadcasting live over the closing credits of Devil in the Dark informed the audience, "Star Trek will be back in the fall, and please, don't write any more letters." It was the first time in television history that a network directly informed viewers that their favorite series had been renewed. Refusing to heed NBC's request and wanting to express their joy, however, many loyal fans wrote thank you letters to the network. While everyone at Desilu was pleased with the good news, something didn't quite make sense. I scratched my head. What was behind NBC's renewal of Star Trek? I never bought the campaign to save Star Trek as the only reason the series was brought back for a second year. Perhaps something else, something more related to money and profit, helped change NBC's mind. In 1966, NBC, at the behest of RCA, commissioned the A.C. Nielsen Company to do a study on the popularity of color television series as opposed to all television series. The results were expected and very unexpected. Favorite series were popular whether or not they were viewed in color. For example, NBC's Bonanza series was a top-rated series on the overall national ratings list as well as on the color ratings list. However, in December 1966, with Star Trek having been on the air only 3 months, an NBC executive called with some news. The Nielsen research indicated that Star Trek was the highest-rated color series on television. Putting aside low national ratings and lack of sponsors, perhaps a reason for renewing Star Trek, other than all the phone calls and letters, was its position as the top-rated color series on the full color network. NBC's parent company was RCA. Star Trek sold color television sets and made money for RCA. Regardless, there was a kicker to the theory. While RCA made money selling color television sets, both NBC and Desilu would continue to lose money on the unsuccessful, yet full-color, Star Trek. For the second season, I approved an episodic budget of almost $192,000. Soon, because I felt it to be the proper thing to do, I cut the budget down to $187,500. Not because I wanted the studio to make more money, but rather because I wanted it to lose less money. By this time, Leonard Nimoy's popularity had convinced him of what we already knew. He had the most important role and was the most important actor in the series, so through his agent, he asked for a lot more money.
We had to face the possibility that a new actor might have to be hired to play Mr. Spock. Casting director Joe DiAugusta was asked to prepare an off-the-record list of Vulcan possibilities. But the 3-page list had a hidden purpose. It was a ploy, a bit of psychological warfare designed to induce Leonard to capitulate. Once agents were contacted regarding a possible Spock replacement, Gene knew it wouldn't be long before the news would get back to Leonard, and he'd feel the pressure of look-alike actors being considered for his role. We already had potential replacements who had actually appeared on the show in roles that called for them to wear pointed ears. Early in the first season, Gene had decided that the Romulan enemies, as well as the Vulcan good guys, should have pointed ears, and he cast Mark Leonard as a Romulan commander. Gene reran the episode. He liked what he saw. Mark could definitely replace Nimoy. However, Mark Leonard's strong physical presence lacked the depth and sensitivity that had endeared Leonard Nimoy to his fans. The next choice was Larry Montaigne. Not only was he a good actor, but of all those on the list, he came closest to Nimoy's looks and physicality. When Larry Montaigne was hired to play Spock's rival for the hand of T'Pring, played by Arlene Martell, in the Amok Time episode, the studio took an open option on his services for the series, just in case. Regardless of the many names on the list, only Mark Leonard and Larry Montaigne were seriously considered as replacements for Mr. Spock. But, as we say on Planet Vulcan, when push comes to shove, everyone wants Leonard Nimoy.
The final skirmish came a week later. NBC, the original campaigner against the Spock character and the pointed ears, hearing through Leonard's agent that he might walk off the show, was furious. "What are we hearing, Herb? You're thinking of replacing Nimoy? Are you out of your mind? Our management would go ballistic. Research tells us he's the most popular part of the whole damn show." The war was lost. Nimoy got more money, office expenses, better billing, a more lucrative merchandising deal, and more script input. The other actors received additional increases. DeForest Kelley had already gotten co-star billing, and as I expected, NBC contributed nothing. Desilu now continued to lose even more money on Star Trek.
That second season brought a lot of new headaches and gave birth to as many new stories to tell. Dorothy Fontana found an untried young writer, David Gerald, who had written an unsolicited script that he called A Fuzzy Thing Happened. While Dorothy found much right with the script, I found much wrong. Although the concept was amusing, the story was just too cute. I feared that, with the script calling for Shatner and company to milk everything for laughs, it would lead to a loss of believability. Kirk, Spock, and the others were real people, and real people just did not behave that way. Our finely drawn characters should never parody themselves. After revisions, the script underwent an extensive rewrite by Gene Coon. It was retitled and filmed as The Trouble with Tribbles, and it became one of the most popular of all the Star Trek episodes. David Gerald came back to work with Gene and me during the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation and helped contribute to the new show's development. He also wrote a script entitled Fire and Ice, which Gene junked. That troubled me. Although I had never liked David's original Tribbles script for the first series, I liked this one a lot and believed that it ought to be produced, but I fought a losing battle to change Gene's mind. Later, David departed from the series in unhappy circumstances, along with Dorothy Fontana. Another story features Bill Shatner. One day he stopped me in the middle of the studio street. Now, this was the first time the usually good-natured Shatner had ever complained to me about anything, and he was furious. "Look at this goddamn uniform, Bob. The goddamn material shrinks more every time it's cleaned. The women are the ones who are supposed to have the bare midriffs on this show, not me." I already knew about the problem from watching dailies. All costumes by Screen Actors Guild contract had to be cleaned after each use. So every night the uniforms went to the cleaners, and every morning they came back to the studio, a smidgen smaller and a shade less colorful. "You're right, Bill. I'll take care of it." I knew that shrinkage was only one part of the problem. The other part was Bill himself. As a professional, he worked out strenuously and went on a diet before he began this new TV season. But as the season progressed and time passed, he gained weight, mainly in his midsection. Also, Bill wore lifts to help him attain his advertised height of 5'11", and the high heels threw his posture awry, pushing out his stomach and making him look slightly sway-backed. Then Bill said, "Your studio is a cheap studio." I replied, "Not mine, Bill. Ours. It's our studio and we love it. By the way, has anyone ever told you that you're beautiful when you're angry?" His inborn good nature took hold. He laughed. My gaze shifted to his hairline. Examining balding actors' hairlines was a habit I'd picked up over the years. The lace that anchored the front of his toupee glistened. I made a mental note to tell the makeup man about it before we filmed our captain again. I was really tempted to ask Bill if he had ever found the so-called missing hairpiece that disappeared at the end of the first season. But no, discretion was the better part of valor. We had begun the first season with 2 new toupees for Bill because his personal ones were too ratty-looking. But somehow one of them disappeared during the hiatus between seasons. So we had to have a new hairpiece built for him. Bill wasn't the only one whose hair ended up on the Lost in Action list. During the second season, I sent a memo to Gene complaining, "Majel Barrett's wig has disappeared. Nobody, including Majel, knows what has happened to it. And Nichelle Nichols' wig has also disappeared. She borrowed it when she finished working and claims that she returned it." That takes us up to here on missing hair goods. Gene didn't respond to my memo, so I cornered him in his office. "Did you find out about Majel?" I asked. "What do you mean?" he replied, suddenly anxious. "Find out what?" "About her missing wig." He seemed curiously relieved. "Oh, well, I asked her, and she says she has no idea where it is." "Yeah, I'll bet. What about Nichelle's wig?" He didn't respond. "Did you ask her?" I persisted. He just looked at me and smiled sheepishly. "Come on, Bob. What do you want me to do? Go search her apartment?" I nodded. "Sounds like a good idea to me. You know where she lives, don't you?"
Hair figured prominently in the case of another Enterprise crew member. Soon after the series debuted, Gene Roddenberry was on the prowl to add yet another character to his show's already large cast. He wanted someone who would appeal to younger television viewers. In a September 22, 1966 memo to casting director Joe D'Augusta, Gene wrote, "Keeping our teenage audience in mind, also keeping aware of current trends, let's watch for a young, irreverent, English accent Beatle type to try on the show, possibly with an eye to him reoccurring, like the smallish fellow who looks to be a hit on the Monkees." In the spring of 1967, with the second season of Star Trek now a fait accompli, Gene Roddenberry set out in earnest to find his new monkey. But while the hairstyle would remain, Gene intended to go where only one other TV show had gone before. Like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., Star Trek would have a Russian as one of the good guys. And of all the places, the recommendation came directly from the Kremlin. Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party, had criticized Star Trek as being typically capitalistic and questioned why there was no Russian crewman aboard the Enterprise. After all, the Russians were doing quite well in the race for outer space. Gene Roddenberry liked the idea. On the recommendation of director Joseph Pevney, actor Walter Koenig was interviewed for the part of Lieutenant Chekhov, the series' new Russian crew member. Pevney recalls that Walter had the worst Russian accent you ever heard. But Gene was taken with the actor and selected him to play the role after first making certain that a Beatle-type hairstyle would work well on the new recruit. With Star Trek now well into its second season, Gene had already achieved a semblance of the cult status he would later enjoy. Working hard and late in his office, as usual, Gene took a breather when I dropped by one night. "I don't have enough time for everything in a single day, Herb." He took a drag on his cigarette. "And there are, all those women." "Women? I thought you were busy with the scripts, Gene." Oh, I am, but the women, they keep after me, all the time. They want me to father their children." As Bob Justman later said, Gene Roddenberry, the creator, had become Gene Roddenberry, the creator. Because the Star Trek budget was such a problem, I made several decisions I would later have preferred not to have made. One of them, the modification in Sandy Courage's main title theme, was the most emotionally significant casualty of the budget wars. Everyone on the show loved the soprano voice that soared high over Sandy's orchestral sounds, but when I was presented with certain facts and figures, my love affair with the voice began to wane. With the possibility of a full 26 episodes for Star Trek in its second year, the likelihood of post-network syndication became more of a reality. It was pointed out that while no musicians would receive rerun fees under the agreement with the American Federation of Musicians, the soprano singer, Lulie Jean Norman, having been hired under a Screen Actors Guild agreement, had to be treated as an actress. She would receive rerun fees. The money was small, but the issue was huge. If money could be saved for the rest of Star Trek's life by replacing a human sound with an electronic sound, why shouldn't a reasonable and responsible management make the change? It was a good argument. I called RJ and told him not to hire the soprano again for the new season. He wasn't happy, but the change was made. And since Sandy Courage never watched the series after the first season, he was totally unaware of the change until we informed him 27 years later. If I were faced with doing it over again, the soprano would have stayed. In February of 1967, Gulf and Western announced their intention to acquire Desilu, for which they would pay $17 million. Gulf and Western had already acquired Paramount Pictures, and it proceeded to merge the two neighboring studios. In early May, I officially resigned my position at Desilu and was appointed Vice President Programs, Paramount Television. The Desilu mimeograph machine worked overtime as Lucy prepared her sincere thanks to her employees. After 4 years of rebuilding a dying studio, I received nothing more from Lucy than the mimeograph form memo. To all employees, I have sold the studio. Thanks for everything. Love, Lucy. And there was that little heart logo from I Love Lucy at the end. Years later, I saw Lucy in Beverly Hills. We stopped to chat. She thanked me for rebuilding her studio, though there was no mention of Star Trek. We said goodbye. My Desilu days were finally over. And the bottom line was that Star Trek now belonged to Gulf and Western and Paramount Pictures. History would show that Gulf and Western's purchase of Star Trek alone, the low-rated, money-losing second-year series on NBC, would become one of the most spectacular business deals in entertainment history.
While Star Trek's status remained tenuous, it was quickly becoming the darling of popularity polls. In TV Week's second annual poll, which listed favorites by age group, Star Trek was chosen favorite by the two most important age groups, 20 to 30 and 30 to 40. By October 1967, it seemed that things were looking up for Star Trek. With a total of 55 episodes guaranteed, the odds for a third season, if not more, seemed to improve. We were all sad when Herb Solow resigned. Without him, Star Trek would never have happened in the first place. And without him, Star Trek's struggle to remain on the air would only become more desperate. By the time the Christmas holidays rolled around, those directly involved with Star Trek were already asking, when do we hear about next season? The last episode of the second season wrapped on January 10, 1968. It was called Assignment Earth and had been planned by Roddenberry and written by Art Wallace as a spin-off pilot, an episode within the series that was intended to find its own life as a separate new series on the next NBC fall schedule. Gene recognized that if Star Trek was canceled, an Assignment Earth series would keep him on the air and employed. Despite Gene's efforts, Assignment Earth was neither a good episode nor a great pilot. It wasn't even a good pilot. So the second production season ended, not with a whimper, but not with a bang either. By the end of the second season, Gene was spending more and more time away from work, having fun with Majel. He bought a motorcycle and dressed in black leather. Majel had a matching outfit. It made for quite a sight as Gene, astride a small Honda, motored away from the office and out the studio auto gate, with Majel hanging on behind. Gene began to roll his own cigarettes. He knew I disapproved and tried to convince me that there's nothing wrong with grass, Bob. You ought to try some. It has no bad side effects like booze and tobacco. It ought to be legalized, but there's too many powerful groups opposed to it, like the liquor lobby and the tobacco companies. I couldn't come to terms with what I had heard. I thought, what are you talking about? You're an ex-cop. How long have you been smoking that stuff? But I couldn't say it. I kept silent. After all, it was his life, but I was disappointed in him. Gene saw me shake my head, and he smiled. We never discussed the subject again. Later, after Gene Roddenberry and Majel Barrett married, there was another aspect of Gene Roddenberry's character, something that perplexed me even more, that we did discuss. Gentle as he seemed, Gene sometimes displayed a sadistic side to his nature when, at parties and in Majel's presence, he hinted at affairs with other women. Her reaction seemed to please him. She looked stricken. I felt tremendous empathy for her. Alone later, I called him on it. That's kind of cruel, Gene. You hurt her when you say those things. Strangely, Gene even took a perverse kind of pleasure from that. He smiled. You're mistaken, Bob. You don't know her like I do. Besides, it adds a little spice to the mix. In the fall of 1967, the ratings hadn't improved, but a new force had arrived. Trekkies. At least that's what we called them then. I had noticed a stranger lurking about our offices. She seemed to be friendly with Gene and was often in his office, but when I came in she usually left. One day I asked, Gene, who the hell is that? Oh, that's B. Joe Trimble. She's got a lot of pull with our fans. I've hired her to help out on our letter-writing campaign. Our letter-writing campaign? What letter-writing campaign? Whereupon Gene explained his strategy to get a renewal for another season. Through her contacts, Bijo was organizing a massive nationwide effort. Gene arranged for Bijo to rent an office. The studio would reimburse him for her expenses. Gene gloated. We'll bury NBC up to their eyeballs in protest letters, Bob. They'll never know what hit them. Then he swore me to secrecy. If NBC were to find out that he was masterminding the effort, it would be all over for Star Trek and him. Soon the letter-writing campaign began to bear fruit. U.S. Postal Service workers began to complain about the poundage of mail they had to deliver to NBC. It seemed to be increasing exponentially. In his book, I Am Not Spock, Leonard Nimoy maintained that the actual NBC count was 114,667 pieces of mail received between December 1, 1967 and March 1, 1968, of which 52,151 pieces of mail were received in the month of February alone. Roddenberry's estimate that 1 million pieces were received certainly differs greatly. However, according to Alan Baker, who was director of program publicity for NBC during those years, in the months of January and February 1968, NBC's Star Trek mail count totaled 12,000 pieces. Baker states, this was such an enormous amount for the NBC mailroom to handle, we had to hire 2 temporary employees to deal with the volume. The 2 worked a full week along with the regular staff, just replying to the Star Trek mail. If we had received the amount of mail the Star Trek people said we received, believe me, I would have known about it.
The flood of letters arriving certainly caught the attention of NBC, and for the second year in a row, in an on-the-air live announcement, Star Trek fans were informed at the close of the March 1st episode, The Omega Glory, that Star Trek had been renewed for a 3rd season.
Gene seemed really re-energized. He promised to become fully involved with the show again. With Gene back at the helm, Star Trek was now going to be better than ever. Then another shoe dropped. NBC had been busy juggling its lineup of shows in its attempts to solidify a successful schedule. We got a new time, but it would be Friday night at 10, a time that Gene knew would guarantee failure. Gene's enthusiasm disappeared. With the certainty that the third season would be the show's last season, he pulled back and began to investigate other, greener pastures. With Gene losing heart, I was the only one on staff who could keep everything together. I was now acting as the de facto story editor, reading, analyzing, and writing reports to Gene on all the unsolicited stories and teleplays arriving in the Star Trek offices every day. But before any story editor was hired, Gene had a surprise for me. "Good news, Bob," Gene said, smiling. "I'm going to keep my executive producer title after all. Star Trek's going to have a new producer this year." "Great, Gene. This was what I had waited for. I would finally get the title to go along with what I actually did." Then Gene said, "Fred Freiberger's coming in as our new producer next Monday. He'll be a big help to me writing herd on stories and scripts." I'm sure the smile froze on my face. "Gene, I thought I was going to produce. That was the understanding." "Oh, you will, Bob. Fred'll be producer, and you'll be co-producer." It was like a good news, bad news joke. Only this one was on me.
Fred Freiberger was an experienced television writer-producer who also had the good fortune to be represented by Gene Roddenberry's agent and thus had direct access to Gene. When Fred became Star Trek's new main man, not only was he thrown into a nest of feuding actors at a recalcitrant studio, but when the show's captain, Roddenberry himself, deserted ship and turned over his command, Freiberger was suddenly alone at the top. There was continued competition between Bill Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. Nimoy's constant demand for scripts with a more involved Spock who maintained the original character values, and Shatner's insistence that he was still the star of the series put unusual pressures on Freiberger. Freiberger held a meeting with Shatner and Nimoy in Gene's old office, where he explained the complex nature of the situation. It was something that Gene Roddenberry had been well aware of for at least 2 years. Freiberger then proceeded to confess that those pressures were preventing him from properly performing his role as the series producer. Shatner and Nimoy hung on his every word. "Gee, I'm sorry to hear that, Fred," said Gene. "I hope you get it straightened out real soon." Gene stood. "Well, I have to go now." As Gene started to leave his old office, Freiberger stopped him and asked the multi-million-dollar question. "Gene, please tell me, who's the star of the series? Is it Bill or is it Leonard?" Both actors leaned forward eagerly. Gene became quiet. He grabbed a cigarette, lit it quickly, inhaled deeply, and stared wide-eyed into the space above him. "Ah, I see," he mused. He looked out of the window, shook his head in Buddha-like fashion, but said nothing else. He looked at neither Bill nor Leonard. Perhaps he was hoping they would jump into the conversation and solve the matter, actor to actor. They did not. It was up to Star Trek's creator. "You're really putting me on the spot, Fred," said Gene Roddenberry. "Sorry, Gene, but I have to know," responded Freiberger. "Is it Bill or is it Leonard?" Gene Roddenberry walked to the door to leave, but turned and stared angrily at Freiberger. Gene was sweating. "It's Bill. Bill is the star of the series." Gene left immediately, and a smiling Shatner and a sullen Nimoy returned to the set. Freiberger, though he got his answer, had unfortunately failed to realize how deep-seated the animosities were in Gene Roddenberry's happy Star Trek family. Putting Gene on the spot with Shatner and Nimoy present had permanently damaged his relationships with both Nimoy and Gene.
Though Gene Coon left at the end of the second season, his influence continued to be felt. As a condition of being let out of his contract, he had promised to complete work on a number of his story premises if Star Trek was renewed for a third season. The Last Gunfight was one of the stories that he was developing at the time he left Star Trek. But now Gene Coon was working elsewhere on an exclusive contract with Universal Television. Being a man of his word, however, he arranged for Lee Cronin, his pseudonym, to complete the assignment. It was filmed and retitled Spectre of the Gun. Lee Cronin also contributed 2 third-season stories, Wink of an Eye and Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, as well as writing the story and teleplay for Spock's Brain, an episode in which, as a result of a suggestion from me, Spock's purloined brain, after being rescued, takes over during surgery and instructs Dr. McCoy exactly how to go about reinserting it back where it came from, inside Spock's skull. Many fans consider that one show to be a worthy candidate for the worst Star Trek episode of all time. During the third season, low ratings weren't the only thing which was taking a toll upon morale. If Herb had still been there, at least I would have been rewarded with full producer status. And to cap it all off, I was tired from 3 seasons of exhausting work. The thrill was gone. I despaired about the show's loss of quality. By the time episodes were filmed, whatever excitement existed in the original stories and scripts had been diluted by a rewriting process which was no longer overseen by Gene Roddenberry. It was now strictly budget-driven. By the midpoint of the production season, I dreaded coming to work every day. It felt like being in prison, and I wanted out. I needed to leave Star Trek. No one is indispensable. We were shooting our 14th episode, and there were only 10 left to finish out the season. And with Eddie Milkus and Greg Peters now functioning as associate producers, Star Trek's production and post-production would be in capable hands if I left. I was informed that the studio couldn't keep me from leaving if I really wanted to. Their meaning was implicit. If I left, I'd regret it. While angered over Paramount's none-too-veiled threat, I still tried to put everything in proper perspective when a new player entered the decision-making process. Herb Solow, the man who had originally involved me with Star Trek and who had left Paramount to become head of MGM Television, called. "Hey, RJ, what's doing? Are you having any fun?" I described the situation. In retrospect, I realized Herb, who always had his ear to the ground, had gotten wind of what was going on. "Listen, RJ, I can't tell you what to do, but if you're interested, I have a new project, a 2-hour pilot for NBC called Then Came Bronson. It needs a producer, a full producer. Why don't you come on over here and have some fun again?" I was still torn until Herb added, "Nobody's ever attempted to do a show like this before. They say it can't be done, so I thought you might like to try it with me." The following morning I went into the studio and quit. And for the next 18 years, I was persona non grata at Paramount.
The close of Star Trek's third production year was markedly different from years 1 and 2. Other than the show's most devoted fans, no one seemed to care whether or not it would be renewed. There were no marches, no massive letter writing and phone campaigns, no important science fiction writers leading the charge, nothing. Neither Gene Roddenberry nor Paramount nor Ashley Famous lifted a finger to promote the dying series. The countdown to oblivion began with the shooting of the last episode, Turnabout Intruder. 7 dull and uneventful days later, on January 9th, 1969, it was over. There's a saying that echoes far out in space. It ain't over until a fat Telosian sings. And after 79 episodes of joy and sorrow, birthday parties and bad marriages, lifelong friendships and short-lived hostilities, broken dreams and pride of performance, Star Trek was canceled at the end of its third year. The fat Telosian had finally sung. The first prime-time adult science fiction color television series would always be looked on as a gallant and expensive effort that failed. Star Trek was consigned to perpetual oblivion in the most distant quadrant of the most distant galaxy, to a place where all unsuccessful series go to die. It would never be heard from again.
So, Star Trek was dead. Or was it? The accepted story is that the series began to develop its syndication afterlife in 1972, well after its network cancellation. Actually, that wasn't exactly true. The year was 1967, shortly after the Gulf and Western purchase of Desilu and its absorption into Paramount. The place was the Hotel Warwick in New York City, and the occasion was a Saturday morning breakfast meeting between Dick Block, president of Kaiser Broadcasting, and Bob Newgard, head of Paramount Domestic Syndication. Kaiser Broadcasting owned 5 major market UHF stations, Philadelphia, Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, and San Francisco. and Block was always on the lookout for an inexpensive program buy. Years earlier, he had wanted to buy the CBS network reruns of one of his favorite series, Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. But, heeding well-intentioned advice from his fellow executives, Block dropped the idea and the purchase. The Twilight Zone went on to become one of the most successful syndication packages ever to come off the networks. Another of Block's favorite series was Star Trek, and he wasn't about to be talked out of that one. Block proposed buying the syndication rights to Star Trek before it was canceled, something relatively unheard of at the time. He would pay less than the going rate. After all, he was guaranteeing the sale and the money. A year and a half before Star Trek was canceled by NBC, Kaiser Broadcasting bought what turned out to be 79 episodes of Star Trek for their local stations. Star Trek on the Kaiser Broadcasting stations was a major programming achievement, and word of the rating success soon spread to independent stations in other cities. The original 79 episodes were scheduled in late afternoon and early evening time periods, and run, rerun, and rerun again all over the country and eventually all over the world.
In 1902, the Canadian medical historian Sir William Osler wrote, "The foolishness of yesterday has become the wisdom of tomorrow. Star Trek's detractors may have called it foolishness, but they can't deny the firestorm it generated." And, without a doubt, Gene Roddenberry was the spark that ignited it all. Star Trek was Gene's only successful creation. It was a great show. But I have regrets. I regret that Gene never publicly nor privately thanked Desilu and its executives and NBC and its executives for supporting him and his series. Gene became a very famous and a very wealthy man because of the opportunity they afforded him. Moreover, when the going got tough, Gene failed to keep his part of the bargain and, in essence, abandoned Star Trek in its third and final year. My major disappointment with Gene came over the years as he reinvented the origins of Star Trek, further enlarging the Star Trek legend and the Gene Roddenberry myth. While there is no denying that Gene created the root, the core from which the series grew, there were other major contributors to its growth: Gene Coon, Bob Justman, Matt Jeffries, and me. Unfortunately, the credit for our contributions was washed away in the wake of Gene's disinclination to honor them, and by doing so, he assumed their authorship. The basic Star Trek philosophy was developed by its producers and writers during its production. The fact that so many fans saw, and continue to see, so much more in Star Trek than we ever realized was there makes me happy and proud beyond belief.
Star Trek wasn't just a grand adventure for Kirk and Spock and McCoy and the others. It was a lot more than that. Star Trek was also a grand adventure for Gene Roddenberry and Herb and me, three explorers embarking upon a journey into the unknown, truly a journey where no man had ever gone before. No one else working in television had ever attempted anything so audacious, and yet there we were, charting a perilous course into the unknown. Gene Roddenberry was the man who used Star Trek as a platform to advance his view of mankind's future, a future which embraced non-human cultures. I remember him predicting, "Given the countless billions of stars in our universe, there must be millions of planets out there where intelligent life exists. Someday, people from our planet will encounter them." In September 1986, word went out that a new Star Trek series was in the works. Gene phoned, and soon, 18 years after leaving Paramount, I was back preparing the first season of Star Trek The Next Generation, which only goes to prove the old Hollywood adage, "You'll never work in this town again until we need you." While working on the new series, my relationship with Gene became much closer. There were lots of hugs and kisses from him, and he even went so far as to say, "Love you, Bob," whenever we finished a meeting. And he meant it. It was as if he sensed the end. His end wasn't far off, and he wanted to make amends for the disappointments he had caused in the past. In the fall of 1986, during my initial preparation of Star Trek The Next Generation, it was clearly evident that Gene was in bad shape physically. He would be out of breath after walking 100 feet, and he had to drive a golf cart to visit the stages or other parts of the lot. Despite all the hugs and kisses and an offer to bump me up to executive producer, I left the show in late April 1988 after completing my work on The Neutral Zone, the last episode of the new series' first season. I had some good years left, and I wanted to enjoy them. Gene and I remained close during the ensuing 3.5 years, but every time I saw him, I was struck at how much he seemed to be deteriorating. He was a ghastly sight when I visited him at the UCLA Medical Center. He had just been operated upon to relieve pressure on his brain. His head had been shaved, and he was still weak from the surgery. It took 2 nurses to move his large frame from his bed to a nearby chair. He had difficulty speaking, but he smiled at me constantly. On October 17, 1991, an ailing, wheelchair-bound Gene came to visit me at my home. Ernie Over, the devoted man who helped care for Gene, wheeled him inside. Gene had been looking forward to this visit, as had I. He was in good shape, having suffered a number of strokes, and a surgery to reduce pressure on his brain couldn't correct his condition. It only relieved the symptoms for a while. I knew he didn't have much longer to live, and that he had refused any further efforts to lengthen his life. He didn't want to prolong the agony, both for himself and for the people he loved. Gene seemed to enjoy the visit and told me, "I'd like to come back again real soon, Bob." He smiled a lot, but I did most of the talking. At times he was lucid and responded well, and then suddenly he would seem to slip away. I looked at Ernie. Was I getting through? He shook his head. The visit was over. Ernie wheeled Gene outside and put him into the Rolls-Royce. As Ernie crossed around to the driver's side, I leaned in close to Gene. "Gene, I want you to know something. I always stood up for you. Maybe other people let you down, but not me. Not ever." His smile faded. I looked into his eyes. Did something flicker there, or was it my imagination? I kissed him goodbye, and he smiled once more. I never saw him again. He died exactly 1 week later.
One last memory. RJ and I have talked with many of the people who worked on Star Trek from 1964 to 1969. There was always one overriding emotion, one common thread present in our conversations. Even with the disappointments of impossible schedules and frazzled relationships, every one of us believed, every one of us insisted that it was absolutely the best time of our lives.
Inside Star Trek, The Real Story, was written and read by Herbert F. Solow and Robert H. Justman. It was adapted for audio by George Truitt. Digital editing by Colin Sean Mahoney, with post-production by Gary Fink. Music arranged and performed by Stephen Kinnickstein. Theme music from the Star Trek television series was composed by Alexander Courage and Gene Roddenberry, and used courtesy of Bruin Music. Original music was composed by Richard Emmett and Sam McCallum. The associate producer was Florence Barreau Adams. Inside Star Trek was produced and directed by Linda Woolman. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio. Inside Star Trek, The Real Story is also available in book form from Pocket Books.